The story of the Mongols begins not with the sudden appearance of an empire, but with the vast and unforgiving grasslands of Eurasia that stretch from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of northern China. This immense steppe formed a world of endless horizons, where survival demanded resilience, discipline, and a mastery of the horse. For thousands of years before the Mongols rose to prominence, countless tribes had roamed these plains, shaping a culture that valued mobility, kinship, and the ability to endure hardship with little more than what could be carried on horseback. It was within this environment that the Mongols emerged, not as a single people at first, but as a network of clans and lineages bound together by shifting alliances, rivalries, and the constant struggle to endure against both nature and neighbours. The life of the steppe was not romantic or serene. It was precarious, determined by weather, the fertility of pasture, and the strength to protect herds from enemies. Families moved with the seasons, following the grasslands that fed their animals, and in doing so they cultivated an intimate knowledge of the land and its cycles. Warfare was not an occasional disruption, but a recurring condition of life. Raids, retaliations, and migrations created a rhythm of violence and adaptation, forcing groups to develop both martial skill and flexible strategies for survival. In this context, tribes like the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, and many others carved out their own influence, rising and falling in prominence long before the name Mongol carried weight, beyond a small corner of the steppe. The Mongols were originally one among many. Their ancestors were neither kings nor rulers of vast lands, but pastoralists who endured winters that froze rivers solid and summers that brought scorching winds. Yet within this austere environment lay the foundation of something that would one day shake the known world. The patterns of migration, the bonds of blood brotherhood sworn between warriors, the custom of oath-taking around a communal fire, and the tradition of loyalty to a Khan who could secure spoils and protection, all laid the groundwork for a form of political organisation that was both fragile and adaptive. What appeared to outsiders as scattered clans constantly at war with one another held within it the potential for unity under a leader strong enough to impose order. The earliest records of the Mongols themselves come not from their own writing, but from their neighbours. Chinese chronicles mention tribes inhabiting the northern frontier, sometimes paying tribute, sometimes raiding border settlements, always present as a reminder of the tenuous line between the agrarian world of the south and the nomadic expanses of the north. The Mongols themselves preserved their memory through oral tradition, stories passed down through generations, eventually compiled in works like The Secret History of the Mongols, which, though written later, preserved accounts of their origins, genealogies, and the struggles of their most important figures. These accounts do not present a unified people from the beginning, but instead reveal a lineage forged through hardship, betrayal, and gradual consolidation. What set the Mongols apart from other nomadic confederations that had risen and fallen before them was not the land they occupied, or even the martial skills they possessed, for these were shared by many steppe peoples. Their uniqueness lay in the emergence of a leader who could transform fragmented clans into a disciplined force, who could channel the cultural strengths of steppe life into a political system that demanded loyalty beyond kinship ties. Before that leader appeared, the Mongols lived as countless others had, vulnerable to stronger neighbours, dependent on fragile alliances, and shaped by the harsh equilibrium of steppe existence. But the environment that threatened to extinguish them also prepared them for survival on a scale no one could yet imagine. The steppe, with its open spaces and lack of natural barriers, offered no permanent protection against invasion. Strength lay in mobility, in the horse herds that provided food, transport, and military power. A boy learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk, and the skill of the mounted archer became second nature by adolescence. To hunt, to raid, to fight from horseback, to endure the cold with nothing but felt tents and dried meat. These were not skills acquired for glory, but necessities of life. Out of these necessities grew a people accustomed to hardship, quick to adapt, and ready to follow leaders who could promise both plunder and protection. As centuries passed, nomadic confederations rose and fell across the steppe. The Xiongnu, centuries earlier, had once threatened China's borders. The Turks had built empires stretching from Asia into Europe. The Khitans and Yushans in northern China developed states blending nomadic traditions with sedentary rule. Against this backdrop, the Mongols remained relatively obscure, a small tribal grouping among many, overshadowed by larger and more powerful neighbours. Yet obscurity was not permanent. From these scattered beginnings, a process was already unfolding that would in time bring forth the figure of Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, whose name would be carried in fear and awe from the Pacific to the edges of Europe. The story of the Mongols, then, is not one of a sudden explosion from nothing but of deep roots within the ecology and culture of the steppe. It is the story of how survival traditions could be transformed into instruments of conquest, of how shifting alliances hardened into an empire, and of how a people who once seemed destined to remain on the margins of history instead reshaped the fate of continents. Before Temujin's rise, before the thunder of hooves shook the plains of Eurasia, the Mongols were one more thread in the vast fabric of nomadic life. To understand how they became the force they did, one must first look closely at the steppe world they inherited, for it was there in its windswept expanses that the seeds of empire were sown. The world of the steppe stretched across Eurasia in a seemingly endless belt of grassland that rolled from the fringes of Eastern Europe, across the heart of Central Asia, and into the northern reaches of China and Mongolia. It was a world without high mountains to hem in its horizons, without vast forests to break its continuity, and without the dense rivers and farmland that sustained sedentary civilizations elsewhere. Instead, it was a land defined by openness and movement. Those who lived here did not depend on settled agriculture or permanent cities, for such things could not endure in the shifting climate and thin soils of the grassland. Instead, they followed their herds across the plains, their lives tied to the rhythms of pasture, water, and weather. The ecology of the steppe created a particular kind of society. Herd animals, horses above all, but also sheep, goats, yaks, and camels, were the foundation of life. They provided milk, meat, hides, and transport, and they moved constantly in search of grazing grounds. This meant that the families who relied on them had to be equally mobile. A tent of felt stretched over wooden frames could be packed onto carts and carried across great distances, reassembled at the next campsite in a matter of hours. A household was not a fixed structure rooted to the earth, but a circle of tents that could shift with the needs of the animals. The great wide rivers, when frozen in winter, became highways of travel, while in summer they provided critical water for both people and flocks. It was a world in motion, and out of this motion grew a culture that valued adaptability, resilience, and skill in horsemanship. From the outside, sedentary civilizations that bordered the steppe often regarded it as a place of danger, inhabited by restless tribes who descended without warning to raid villages and caravan routes. Chinese dynasties built walls and fortifications to keep them out, while Persian and later Islamic chroniclers described nomads as both a threat and a source of mercenaries who could be turned against rivals. Yet within the steppe itself, life was organised by codes of kinship and loyalty, rules of hospitality and vengeance, and traditions that balance freedom with obligation. To survive in such an environment, one needed the protection of family networks and the security of belonging to a group that could defend its herds and respond to threats. A man without kin was vulnerable, and to lose one's place in a tribe was often to lose one's place in life. Centuries before the Mongols appeared as a distinct people, the steppe had already produced powerful confederations. The Xiongnu, in the centuries before the Common Era, had built a formidable empire that challenged the might of Han China. The Turks, beginning in the 6th century, spread their influence across Central Asia, leaving linguistic and cultural imprints that endure to this day. Later, The Khitans and the Jurchens in Manchuria and northern China created states that blended nomadic traditions with administrative systems borrowed from the Chinese. Each of these confederations rose from the same conditions of the grassland: the need for unity in the face of external threat, the power that came from mastering mounted warfare, and the fragile balance between tribal independence and collective authority under a Khan or ruler strong enough to command respect. It was in this setting that the people later known as the Mongols lived. They were not alone on the steppe, nor were they dominant. They were one among many groups: Tatars, Naimans, Merkits, Khanates and others, each with their own leaders, herds and shifting alliances. The boundaries between them were never fixed. Intermarriage, feuding, and conquest constantly reshaped their identities. A tribe might rise in power by seizing control of trade routes or pastures, only to fall when rivals united against them. Loyalties shifted according to circumstance, and a leader's ability to provide booty, protection and justice determined whether followers stayed or drifted away. This instability was not chaos in the sense outsiders sometimes imagined. It was a political order adapted to the realities of nomadic life, where flexibility mattered more than permanence, and where authority was measured in the ability to lead in war and redistribute wealth afterward. The material culture of the steppe reflected its mobility. Weapons were lightweight and suited for horseback use: composite bows of wood, horn and sinew that could strike with lethal force at long range, sabres that curved for slashing strikes while riding, lances that extended a warrior's reach. Armour was often made from layers of leather, sometimes reinforced with iron, providing protection without sacrificing the ability to ride swiftly. A mounted warrior could travel enormous distances in a day, and entire armies could seem to vanish into the grasslands only to reappear hundreds of kilometres away. Speed was survival, and mobility was power. Religion on the steppe reflected the forces of nature that dominated daily existence. The sky itself was revered as Tengri, the eternal blue heaven, and shamans mediated between the human and spirit worlds through rituals that sought guidance, healing, or protection. The earth, the ancestors and natural forces like rivers and mountains were also venerated, creating a cosmology that tied people to the landscape even as they moved across it. Rituals accompanied important moments: births, deaths, oaths of loyalty, declarations of war. A Khan did not rule by military strength alone, but by demonstrating that he held the favour of heaven, that his victories reflected cosmic approval. This spiritual dimension was not separate from politics, but interwoven with it. The legitimacy of a ruler came not just from his ability to command, but from the belief that his rise was sanctioned by higher powers. This idea, later embodied in the notion of the mandate of heaven in Chinese political theory, resonated in the steppe as well, though it took the form of Tengri's blessing. To follow a leader was to trust that he was chosen by heaven, and to betray him was not just a political act but a spiritual transgression. Such beliefs gave cohesion to alliances that might otherwise have dissolved under the pressure of rivalry. Trade bound the steppe to the surrounding civilizations, even as conflict often strained those relationships. Herd products like horses, hides, wool, and meat were exchanged for grain, textiles, and luxuries from China, Persia, and beyond. Steppe horses in particular were prized, their stamina and speed making them essential for armies from the Middle East to East Asia. Caravans carried silk, silver, and spices across the great routes that connected East and West, and nomadic tribes both protected and preyed upon this traffic, depending on circumstance. Control of trade routes could enrich a leader and elevate his tribe's status, while loss of access could weaken even the strongest confederation. For outsiders, the apparent instability of the steppe world was difficult to comprehend. To Chinese dynasties, the nomads seemed unpredictable, sometimes offering tribute, sometimes raiding, sometimes demanding marriage alliances. Yet this unpredictability was itself a strategy. To survive in a land of scarce resources, Nomadic groups adapted to opportunities as they arose, shifting allegiance, demanding concessions, or launching raids when it suited their needs. What looked like treachery to outsiders was often simply pragmatism in a harsh environment. Alliances lasted as long as they provided mutual benefit, and peace existed only when it was more profitable than war. The Mongols, before they rose to prominence, inherited this world of shifting balances. They lived in felt tents carried by ox-drawn carts, herded animals across the plains, and participated in the cycles of war and trade that bound the steppe to its neighbours. Their legends and genealogies preserved memories of ancestors who fought and died in these struggles, who formed alliances through blood oaths, and who swore vengeance against enemies who had wronged them. Their children grew up with bows in their hands and horses at their side, preparing for lives that would be inseparable from the demands of mobility and conflict. Nothing in their early existence marked them as destined to dominate Eurasia. They were, as far as anyone could see, one more thread in the ever-changing tapestry of steppe life. Yet within this tapestry were the patterns that would one day allow for something greater. The traditions of oath-taking created the possibility of loyalty beyond kinship. The shared reverence for Tengri provided a spiritual framework for recognizing the authority of a supreme ruler. The skills of horsemanship and archery gave them the tools to fight not only rivals on the steppe, but also settled empires with fortified cities. The fluidity of alliances meant that, under the right circumstances, a leader could gather followers from across tribal boundaries, uniting groups that had once been enemies. The conditions were not unique to the Mongols, but when combined with the extraordinary leadership that would later arise, they formed the foundation for an empire unlike any the steppe had ever produced. The climate of the steppe, unpredictable and often harsh, reinforced the need for this adaptability. Winters could be devastating, with temperatures dropping so low that entire herds might perish, leaving families on the brink of starvation. Droughts in summer could wither the grasslands, forcing migrations into contested territory and sparking conflict with neighbouring groups. In such times, the ability of a leader to secure new pastures or raid settled lands for supplies determined whether his people survived. Famine and scarcity were constant threats, and in the face of such dangers, loyalty often shifted to whoever could provide stability and food. This constant testing of leadership forged a political culture where weakness was not tolerated, and strength was measured in survival. By the late 12th century, when Temujin was born, this world was already well established. The Mongols were known to their neighbours but not yet feared. The Jin dynasty in northern China and the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia saw them as raiders, troublesome but not existential threats. The tribes of the steppe viewed them as rivals, no stronger or weaker than others. And yet in their tents, by their campfires, in their struggles against hunger and enemies, they preserved traditions that would soon be harnessed to new ends. Their bows and horses, their oaths and feuds, their reverence for Tengri, all of these would become instruments in the hands of a leader who could transform them from scattered clans into the most formidable force the world had ever seen. The foundations of the Mongols, then, were not built in cities of stone or along rivers rich with agriculture. They were built in the windswept grasslands, in the bitter cold of winter and the scorching heat of summer, in the traditions of nomadic life that valued resilience, mobility, and loyalty. It was this world that gave birth to the people who would one day rise to dominate Eurasia, a world where the seeds of empire were sown in the daily struggle to survive on the steppe. Temujin was born into a world that was already uncertain and dangerous, where the balance of survival shifted with the seasons and with the strength of family bonds. His birth, around the year 1162 according to most sources, came at a time when the Mongol people were one among many fragmented tribes of the eastern steppe. Nothing about the circumstances of his arrival suggested that he would grow into one of the most consequential figures in history. He was not born into the settled grandeur of an empire with walled cities and palaces, but into a felt tent pitched among the herds, where the cries of the animals mixed with the winds of the open plain. His people were vulnerable, subject to raids, betrayals, and the constant struggle to hold together fragile alliances. Temujin's father was Yesugei, a chief of the Borjigin clan, which itself was one among the many Mongol lineages. Yesugei was not a ruler of wide dominions, but a man of reputation and ability, whose power rested on his capacity to command loyalty in war and maintain ties through marriage and alliance. His strength derived less from the permanence of institutions than from the shifting loyalty of followers who would support him as long as he could protect them and bring spoils. His mother was Hörlun, taken in marriage by Yesugei after she'd been seized from her first husband in a raid, a reminder that the lives of women on the steppe were often entwined with the politics of war and capture. It was in this environment, shaped by both violence and survival, that Temujin first entered the world. The story of his birth, preserved in the secret history of the Mongols, carried the aura of legend. It was said that when he was born, he clutched a blood clot in his hand, a sign interpreted as an omen that he was destined for greatness and war. Such symbolism was not uncommon in steppe traditions, where unusual births were often seen as indicators of future destiny. Yet omens alone did not determine the life of a child on the steppe. What mattered more was whether he could survive infancy, whether his family could provide enough food through the bitter winters, and whether the tribe could protect itself from enemies. From the very beginning, Temujin's life was marked by hardship. His father's position was not secure, and rival tribes circled constantly. Even as a boy, Temujin was confronted with the fragility of tribal power. His father had secured his future in part by arranging a marriage alliance, promising his young son to Berta, a girl of another clan, when both were still children. This was common practice, for marriage was not only a personal matter, but a political strategy, binding clans together and creating obligations that might ensure peace or cooperation in times of conflict. The bond between Temujin and Berta would later prove critical, shaping both his personal life and his political career, but the stability that Yesugei had worked to maintain was abruptly shattered when Temujin was still a boy. On a journey, Yesugei encountered members of the Tatars, a rival tribe. Sharing food with them, he was poisoned, and though he managed to return to his family, he soon died. The death of a Khan, even one of modest stature like Yesugei, left his household exposed. Without the presence of a strong leader to protect them, followers deserted and enemies closed in. Hörlun found herself widowed with young children, abandoned by those who had once owed loyalty to her husband. What remained was a small household on the edge of survival, forced to fend for themselves without the protection of a broader tribe. The years that followed were brutal. Hörlun and her children were cast out into the wilderness, left to survive on their own. Food was scarce, and their family, once the nucleus of a small band of followers, was reduced to poverty. They scavenged, fishing in rivers, digging for roots, hunting small animals when they could, and enduring winters with little shelter beyond their felt tents. For Temujin, still a boy, this period was formative. It instilled in him the knowledge of what it meant to be vulnerable, to live at the mercy of others, and to endure betrayal. He learned that loyalty could vanish when a leader faltered, and that only strength could compel others to stay. The memory of these early years never left him, and throughout his later life he carried with him a ruthless determination never again to be abandoned, never again to let weakness expose him to destruction. Family bonds, however, were not free of conflict. Temujin's household included not only his full brothers, but also half-brothers, and the scarcity of resources bred tension. Rivalries grew, especially with his half-brother Bekta, whose claim to authority conflicted with Temujin's own sense of leadership. The secret history recounts how this rivalry culminated in Temujin and his younger brother Kasar killing Bekta, a stark reminder that even within the family, survival sometimes required brutal choices. This act, while harsh, revealed a trait that would characterize Temujin's leadership later: the willingness to eliminate rivals decisively rather than allow them to undermine his authority. Temujin's childhood was therefore not one of carefree herding or security, but of relentless struggle. His mother's resilience was essential. Herlin worked tirelessly to keep her children alive, gathering food, maintaining the tent, and teaching them the customs and traditions of their people. She reminded them constantly of their noble lineage, insisting that though they were cast adrift, they were not ordinary. This sense of identity, of belonging to the Borjigin line, was a source of pride and a tool for survival, for it gave Temujin and his siblings a claim to leadership even when their circumstances made them appear powerless. As Temujin grew older, he began to seek allies beyond his immediate family. The system of Anda, or sworn brotherhood, provided one path. On the steppe, friendship could be formalized into a lifelong bond through ritual, creating ties as strong as those of blood. Temujin swore such a bond with Jamuka, a boy of similar age who would later become both his closest ally and his bitter rival. Their relationship embodied the potential and the peril of steppe politics. Friendship could bind men together in loyalty, but ambition could just as easily tear them apart. For now, their bond represented a promise of shared destiny, a connection that might provide Temujin with the support he needed to rise again from obscurity. But alliances alone could not shield him from danger. As a youth, he was captured by the Taichiud, a rival clan. Bound with a wooden collar to prevent escape, he lived as their captive, subject to humiliation and control. Yet even in this condition, he demonstrated a resilience that impressed others. According to tradition, he eventually escaped with the help of a sympathetic family within the tribe, an episode that underscored both the cruelty and the complexity of steppe politics, where enmity could coexist with acts of mercy. His escape was more than just survival. It was a testament to his determination and ability to inspire others, qualities that would later draw entire nations to his banner. By the time he reached adolescence, Temujin had already experienced abandonment, poverty, betrayal, captivity, and violence. He had also learned the value of loyalty, the power of decisive action, and the necessity of forging alliances beyond the narrow circle of kin. These lessons, hard won, shaped the foundations of his character. Where others might have been broken by such adversity, he was hardened. The boy who had once been left to starve on the steppe grew into a young man with an unyielding resolve, determined to reclaim the status his father had lost and to carve out a destiny not dependent on the shifting whims of others. The marriage alliance with Berta, arranged in his childhood, became an anchor for this ambition. When the time came, Temujin travelled to claim his bride, solidifying the tie between his household and hers. Berta would later prove more than a political connection. She became a steadfast partner, enduring hardships alongside him and providing legitimacy to his claims as a leader. In a world where alliances were fragile, the bond of marriage provided continuity and stability, and Temujin's relationship with Berta would remain central to his rise. As Temujin began to gather followers, however modest at first, he relied on the lessons of his youth. He emphasized loyalty, rewarding those who stayed with him through hardship and punishing betrayal with uncompromising severity. He understood that leadership on the steppe was not inherited automatically, but earned through the ability to inspire confidence and demonstrate strength. His followers were not bound by the permanence of institutions, but by the expectation that he could provide victory and protection. Each small success built his reputation, and with reputation came more allies. The hardships of Temujin's early life, then, were not merely obstacles to be overcome, but the crucible in which his leadership was forged. They taught him the fragility of power, the necessity of discipline, and the value of trust. They instilled in him a clarity of purpose that set him apart from others who rose and fell with the tides of fortune. Out of suffering and loss came resilience and ambition, and out of obscurity came the beginnings of a leader who would one day command the loyalty of millions and reshape the history of Eurasia. The transformation of Temujin from an outcast boy into a rising leader on the steppe depended not only on his own resilience and ambition, but on the intricate web of relationships he could build and maintain. In the world of nomadic tribes, no one rose alone. Power was measured in the loyalty of followers, and loyalty was not guaranteed by blood alone. It had to be earned, rewarded, and reinforced through rituals that bound men together more tightly than ordinary friendship. Among these, the practice of Anda, blood brotherhood, held particular importance. It was a solemn pact that transcended family ties, a chosen kinship forged through ritual and sealed by oaths that could not easily be broken. Temujin's youth had been marked by the loss of his father and the collapse of his family's position, leaving him acutely aware of the fragility of alliances and the dangers of betrayal. From this experience grew a determination to construct bonds that were more durable than the shifting loyalties of the steppe. His early oath of brotherhood with Jamuka exemplified this tradition. As boys, they had sworn to be Andas, pledging to stand together as if of one blood. Such bonds were meant to last a lifetime, and in the fluid politics of the steppe they provided a foundation upon which to build trust. For a time, Temujin and Jamuka moved in parallel, their paths converging as they began to gather followers and assert their authority. The process of building a following was gradual, beginning with a handful of companions drawn by loyalty, kinship, or the hope of future rewards. A leader's reputation grew with each successful raid, each act of generosity in distributing spoils, and each demonstration of justice in settling disputes. Temujin's reputation for discipline began to distinguish him from others. Where many tribal leaders accepted followers with loose expectations, Temujin insisted on order. Theft among his men was punished, desertion was not tolerated, and merit was rewarded even when it meant promoting men of low birth above those of noble lineage. This meritocratic tendency, though radical by steppe standards, gave him an edge. Men who might otherwise have remained at the margins of tribal politics saw in Temujin a chance to rise through ability rather than birth. His Anda with Jamuka, however, would prove both a strength and a source of eventual conflict. Jamuka, like Temujin, came from a background that gave him a claim to leadership, and he too sought to unite tribes under his command. At first, their bond drew men to them, creating a formidable alliance. They campaigned together, sharing victories and forging a name that spread beyond their immediate followers. Their oath bound them as brothers, but ambition often tests even the most sacred promises. In time, the difference in their leadership styles and the competition for supremacy would tear them apart. Temujin's marriage to Berta strengthened his position further. Her family ties brought him important allies, and her presence at his side gave legitimacy to his growing band of followers. Yet their union was soon tested when Berta was abducted by the Merkets, one of the powerful tribes of the steppe. The kidnapping of a wife was not only a personal affront but a public humiliation, threatening Temujin's reputation as a leader. To reclaim her, he needed allies. It was then that he turned to Togrul, the Khan of the khanates, who had once been an ally of his father. Temujin addressed him as father, invoking that earlier relationship, and secured his support. Jamuka also joined the campaign, honouring their oath of brotherhood. Together their combined forces overwhelmed the Merkets, and Berta was restored to Temujin. This victory was decisive not only for personal reasons but for political ones. It demonstrated Temujin's ability to mobilise alliances and achieve success in war. It also reinforced the bond between him and Berta, who remained steadfast in her loyalty despite the ordeal. The episode revealed the interconnectedness of personal and political life on the steppe. The loss of Berta would have been a crippling blow to Temujin's credibility, but her recovery strengthened his standing and solidified his claim to leadership. The partnership with Togrul, leader of the khanates, became a cornerstone of Temujin's rise. Togrul, sometimes identified in sources as Ong Khan, commanded respect as a veteran leader of a powerful tribe. By presenting himself as the loyal son of Togrul, Temujin positioned himself within a broader network of authority. This relationship allowed him to expand his influence beyond his immediate circle and provided the support of a seasoned Khan who could lend legitimacy to his campaigns. In the steppe world, where lineage and patronage mattered, aligning with Togrul was a masterstroke. Yet the Andabon with Yamuka soon unravelled. Their different visions of leadership became apparent as their followings grew. Jamuka favoured traditional tribal aristocracy, rewarding noble families and maintaining the established order of privilege. Temujin, by contrast, elevated men of low birth if they proved capable, undermining the traditional hierarchies that had long structured steppe society. This divergence created tension among their followers, and ultimately their alliance fractured. Jamuka declared himself the legitimate ruler of the Mongols, while Temujin, supported by those who valued his meritocratic approach, emerged as his rival. The clash that followed was brutal. Jamuka, commanding a larger force, defeated Temujin in a major confrontation, capturing many of his men. In an act that shocked even the violent norms of the steppe, Jamuka executed 70 young men by boiling them alive, a gesture meant to intimidate rivals but one that cost him support. The atrocity alienated many of his followers, who drifted away to Temujin, drawn by his reputation for discipline and justice. In this moment, the contrast between the two leaders became stark. Jamuka embodied the excesses of traditional tribal warfare, while Temujin represented a new kind of order, harsh but bound by rules that promised stability. From these struggles emerged the outlines of Temujin's distinctive leadership. He demanded loyalty not out of fear alone, but by offering protection and rewards to those who stood by him. He sought to bind men together not merely through blood ties, but through shared purpose, reinforced by ritual and oath. The Anda tradition of brotherhood, though strained by his break with Jamuka, remained central to his vision. He understood that in the world of the steppe, where betrayal was common and alliances fleeting, the only way to secure lasting loyalty was to create bonds that felt sacred. Temujin expanded this principle beyond individual brotherhoods to the structure of his army. He began to organize his followers into units not based on kinship, but on decimal divisions, groups of 10, 100, 1,000. Each man was bound not by family ties but by obligation to his comrades and commander. This system weakened the grip of tribal aristocracy and created a force loyal directly to Temujin. It was a reimagining of military organization, turning the fluid bonds of the steppe into a disciplined structure capable of enduring beyond the fortunes of birth. The rituals of oath-taking, too, took on greater importance. To swear loyalty to Temujin was not a casual gesture, but a solemn act, often sealed with symbolic ceremonies that invoked Tengri, the eternal blue sky, as witness. To break such an oath was to defy not only the Khan, but the spiritual order of the steppe. By elevating these rituals, Temujin created a moral framework for loyalty that extended beyond personal advantage. It was not simply profitable to follow him, it was righteous, sanctioned by heaven itself. As Temujin's reputation spread, more men gathered under his banner, drawn by both the promise of spoils and the sense of order he provided. He was still one leader among many, his position not yet secure, but the foundations of something greater were already visible. His Anda with Yamuka had taught him both the power and the fragility of brotherhood. His alliance with Togrul had shown the importance of patronage and legitimacy. His recovery of Berta had proven his ability to marshal allies for decisive action, and his innovations in organization had set him apart from other tribal leaders who relied on old structures. Out of these experiences, Temujin began to craft the identity that would one day be recognized in the title Genghis Khan. The steppe was vast and rivals remained. The Naimans, the Merkits, the Tatars, all posed challenges. Chinese dynasties to the south watched with interest and apprehension, sometimes offering support to weaken one tribe against another, sometimes preparing defences against raids. In this shifting landscape, Temujin had to navigate constantly, balancing loyalty with pragmatism, punishing betrayal while rewarding those who stood by him. Each campaign, each alliance, each oath of loyalty added to his stature, and with each step the boy who had once been abandoned with his widowed mother and hungry siblings grew closer to becoming the man whose name would echo across continents. By the final years of the 12th century, the steppe was a battlefield of shifting alliances, rivalries and betrayals. Temujin had already endured the loss of his father, the abandonment of his family, the hardships of poverty and the violence of captivity. He had formed bonds of brotherhood and seen them broken, won victories and suffered defeats, and had begun to gather followers who saw in him a leader, different from the chiefs of old. Yet he was still only one power among many. To transform himself into the supreme Khan of the Mongols, he would have to do what no one had managed before, unite the tribes of the steppe into a single, disciplined force under his command. The challenge was immense. The Mongols, Tatars, Merkits, Naimans, Khanates and countless smaller clans had lived for centuries in a cycle of competition and fragmentation. Every attempt at unity had collapsed under the weight of pride, rivalry, and the fierce independence of the steppe aristocracy. The nomadic world was not easily bent to one will. Leaders might command loyalty for a time, but once they faltered, followers melted away, shifting allegiance to whoever promised greater spoils or protection. To forge an empire in such a setting required not only military strength, but a reordering of political culture itself. Temujin began with discipline. He rejected the casual approach to leadership that had long characterized steppe politics. He demanded absolute loyalty, and he reinforced it with a strict system of organization. His decimal structure, units of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000, broke the old tribal order. No longer would men fight in units based solely on kinship. Instead, they were grouped according to this new system, mixing families and clans so that loyalty flowed upward to their commander and ultimately to Temujin himself. By severing the direct link between tribe and military unit, he weakened the power of aristocratic families who might otherwise challenge him. What he built was not a coalition of tribes, but an army that owed its allegiance to him personally. Justice was another pillar of his rise. Temujin understood that grievances could fracture alliances as surely as defeats. To maintain unity, he established a code of law known as the Yasa, which governed not only military matters but also social conduct, trade, and the obligations of followers. Theft was punished severely, especially the stealing of animals, which threatened the very survival of households. Adultery, betrayal, and cowardice were also condemned. Yet the law was not simply a set of restrictions, it was also a promise of fairness. Those who served Temujin could expect protection under his justice, regardless of birth. This contrasted with the favoritism of other tribal leaders, who often privileged their own kin or noble allies. By applying law universally, Temujin attracted men who had been marginalized by the old order. The idea of merit over lineage became one of his defining strategies. Men who proved themselves in battle or in loyalty were promoted, even if they came from humble backgrounds. This practice won him fierce devotion from common warriors, who saw in him a path to honour and wealth that had previously been denied them. At the same time, it antagonized the traditional aristocracy, whose hereditary privileges were undermined. Temujin's willingness to break with custom was both risky and revolutionary, yet his ability to enforce discipline and deliver victories silenced much of the opposition. As long as his followers prospered, they accepted his authority. Military campaigns provided the testing ground for this new order. Temujin struck first at the Tatars, longtime rivals of his father. With the support of Togrul, the Genghis Khan, and aided by alliances with neighbouring tribes, he launched attacks that shattered Tatar power. In victory, he demonstrated his capacity for both ruthlessness and integration. Many captured Tatars were absorbed into his army, reorganized under a system, and bound to him by loyalty and force through law. Leaders who resisted were executed, but those who submitted could find a place in his ranks. The message was clear. Resistance meant destruction, but submission could lead to survival and even advancement. His successes drew more followers, but they also provoked new enemies. Jamukha, once his sworn brother, now his bitter rival, continued to oppose him, rallying tribes who resented Temujin's reforms. The conflict between them escalated into open war, with battles that pitted thousands of warriors against one another across the plains. Temujin's discipline and organisation often gave him the edge, but the balance of power shifted constantly. At times he suffered setbacks, forced to retreat and regroup. Yet each defeat taught him lessons, and each recovery expanded his reputation for resilience. The steppe valued leaders who could endure adversity, and Temujin's ability to rebuild after losses reinforced the sense that he was favoured by heaven. His alliance with Togrul, the Kerit Khan, was also tested. Initially, Togrul acted as a fatherly patron, lending his authority to Temujin's campaigns. Together they crushed enemies and expanded their influence. But as Temujin's power grew, so too did Togrul's suspicion. The old Khan began to fear that his protege might overshadow him. Rivalries among Togrul's advisors deepened the rift, and eventually the alliance collapsed into hostility. War between Temujin and the Khanates was brutal, but once again Temujin's discipline and organisational innovations proved decisive. The Khanates were broken, and Togrul was killed, clearing one of the greatest obstacles to Temujin's supremacy. With each victory, Temujin's authority expanded. The Merkits, who had once abducted Burta, were targeted repeatedly until their power was eradicated. The Naimans, another formidable tribe, resisted fiercely, but were eventually crushed. With the defeat of these rivals, Temujin stood increasingly unchallenged. His forces were no longer a coalition of allies, but an integrated army, bound by law, oath, and organisation. The culmination of this process came in 1206, when a great assembly, or Kurultai, was convened. Leaders and warriors from across the steppe gathered, acknowledging Temujin's supremacy. It was here that he received the title Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. This was not merely a new name, but a declaration that his authority transcended tribal boundaries. For the first time, the Mongol tribes were united under a single leader who commanded not only their loyalty, but their belief that he had been chosen by Tengri to rule, all beneath the eternal blue sky. The unification of the Mongol tribes marked a turning point in world history. What had once been a scattered collection of clans, vulnerable to external powers, was now a disciplined and organised confederation poised for expansion. Genghis Khan had transformed the political culture of the steppe, breaking the cycle of fragmentation and creating an empire rooted in loyalty to his person and his law. The methods he used, discipline, merit, justice, and ruthless enforcement of order, were products of his own life experiences, shaped by betrayal, poverty, and the constant struggle for survival. Out of these hardships he forged a new order, one that would soon test its strength beyond the steppe, against the great civilizations that lay along its borders. The unification of the Mongol tribes did not occur overnight, and it did not happen through diplomacy alone. It was carved out of constant war, shaped in the crucible of raids, ambushes, betrayals, and battles that tested both the resilience of Temujin and the loyalty of those who followed him. Among the many enemies that had to be subdued before he could stand as Genghis Khan, the Tatars were perhaps the most symbolic. For generations they had been rivals of the Borjigin clan, and it was at the hands of the Tatars that Temujin's father had been poisoned. To defeat them was not only a strategic necessity, but also a matter of vengeance, a settling of accounts that had festered since his childhood. The Tatars were not a small or marginal tribe. They had long been among the strongest of the steppe peoples, at times allied with the powerful Jin dynasty of northern China, who used them as a buffer and a weapon against other steppe groups. This connection gave them access to resources and political support, making them formidable opponents. For Temujin, striking at the Tatars meant more than avenging his father. It meant challenging a tribe that had been a pillar of steppe politics for centuries. Victory would signal to all others that he was not merely another tribal chief, but a leader capable of overturning the old order. Temujin approached this campaign with the discipline and organisation that had already begun to set him apart. His army was not a loose coalition of kin-based bands, but a structured force divided into units that could manoeuvre independently yet coordinate with precision. He emphasised preparation, ensuring that supplies were gathered, scouts were deployed, and communication was maintained. On the steppe, where armies lived off their herds and moved swiftly, logistics were as important as bravery. Temujin's attention to detail gave his forces an advantage that rivals often lacked. The campaign against the Tatars was marked by relentless pursuit and decisive engagements. Temujin understood that partial victories were not enough. Steppe politics had long been shaped by inconclusive raids, where one side gained cattle or horses, but the other lived to fight another day. Such outcomes perpetuated the cycle of revenge and instability. Temujin broke from this pattern. When he fought, he aimed to annihilate his enemies as political entities, breaking their power so completely that they could no longer pose a threat. Against the Tatars, this meant not only defeating their warriors, but also dismantling their leadership and absorbing their people into his own system. The battles were fierce, with both sides deploying the tactics of steppe warfare, swift cavalry charges, feigned retreats, ambushes in the grasslands. The Mongol composite bow, fired from horseback, gave Temujin's warriors lethal range and mobility. Discipline made the difference. Where Tatar warriors often fought as loosely organised kin groups, the Mongols struck in coordinated waves, units supporting one another, responding to signals and regrouping with speed. Steppe warfare had always prized mobility, but Temujin transformed it into something more, a form of precision manoeuvre that could overwhelm larger forces through coordination. When the Tatars were finally broken, Temujin's vengeance was severe. According to accounts, he ordered the execution of all Tatar males above a certain height, sparing only children. Such brutality was not arbitrary. It was calculated to eliminate future threats and to demonstrate to other tribes the price of resistance. At the same time, many women and children were absorbed into the Mongol fold, redistributed among his followers, or married into his ranks. In this way, the destruction of the Tatars also became a means of strengthening his own people, binding the survivors to him through necessity and integration. The conquest of the Tatars sent shockwaves across the steppe. It revealed Temujin's uncompromising approach to war and his willingness to employ ruthless measures in the pursuit of security. But it also showcased his capacity to absorb enemies into his system. Those who submitted were given places in his army or administration, reorganized under his decimal structure, their loyalty redirected away from tribal chiefs and toward the Khan himself. This dual strategy, ruthless destruction of resistance combined with generous incorporation of the defeated, was a hallmark of his rise. Yet the Tatars were only one among many rivals. The Merkits, who had abducted Berta years earlier, remained a persistent threat. Temujin pursued them with relentless determination, waging repeated campaigns until their power was broken. The khanates, once his allies under Togrul, turned into enemies when suspicion and rivalry poisoned their relationship. In battle after battle, Temujin demonstrated the same formula: careful preparation, disciplined execution, ruthless punishment of resistance, and strategic incorporation of survivors. The Naimans, another powerful confederation, resisted fiercely, their Khan commanding a broad alliance that seemed capable of checking Temujin's rise. But even they were eventually defeated, their forces scattered, their leaders killed, and their people absorbed into the growing Mongol host. Each conquest brought more than territory. It brought new men, new resources, and new legitimacy. Warriors who might once have fought against Temujin found themselves reorganized into his army, bound by his law, and rewarded for their service. The old tribal aristocracy was systematically undermined, replaced by a merit-based hierarchy loyal to the Khan. Over time, this created a self-reinforcing cycle. Victories brought new followers, which strengthened the army, which enabled further victories. Where other leaders had struggled to maintain coalitions, Temujin built an expanding empire of loyalty that transcended traditional boundaries. The psychological impact of these conquests was as significant as the material gains. On the steppe, reputation was a weapon as powerful as the bow. Tales of Temujin's victories, his discipline, and his ruthlessness spread across the plains. Tribes faced a stark choice: resist and face annihilation, or submit and find a place within the new order. Many chose the latter, calculating that survival under the Khan was preferable to destruction. This dynamic accelerated the process of unification, as tribes that might once have resisted instead approached him voluntarily, offering submission in exchange for protection. But unification was not achieved without cost. Each conquest required bloodshed, and each act of ruthlessness risked creating enemies who might seek revenge. Temujin's challenge was to balance fear with reward, to ensure that those who submitted were not driven to rebellion by harsh treatment. His code of law, his reputation for fairness among his followers, and his willingness to promote men of talent all helped to stabilize the expanding empire. He punished betrayal mercilessly, but rewarded loyalty generously, creating a system where followers knew exactly where they stood. By the early years of the 13th century, the great rivals of the steppe had been subdued. The Tatars, Merkits, Khanates, and Naimans were no longer independent forces but broken remnants absorbed into the Mongol Confederation. What had once been a fragmented landscape of competing tribes was now a unified polity under Genghis Khan, bound by law, organization, and fear. The process had been brutal, but it was effective. For the first time in memory, the steppe stood united under a single leader, who commanded not only the loyalty of his people, but their belief that he was chosen by heaven to rule. And yet, for Genghis Khan, this was only the beginning. The unification of the Mongol tribes was not an end in itself, but a foundation for something larger. With the steppe secured, his gaze turned outward, toward the great civilizations that bordered his world, China to the south, Central Asia to the west. The same methods that had subdued the Tatars and the steppe rivals would soon be unleashed against empires of stone and city walls, testing whether the discipline of the nomadic host could prevail against the wealth and power of sedentary states. Once the tribes of the steppe were subdued and brought under his command, Genghis Khan turned his attention southward, toward the wealthiest and most enduring of his neighbours, the Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin ruled over a vast territory, rich in cities, trade routes, and agricultural lands, far removed from the sparse resources of the Mongolian grasslands. For the nomads, China represented both opportunity and danger. Opportunity, because the abundance of grain, textiles, metalwork, and luxury goods was a prize beyond anything the steppe could produce. Danger, because the sedentary empires to the south had for centuries manipulated steppe politics, supporting one tribe against another, keeping the nomads divided and dependent. To attack the Jin was not simply a raid for loot. It was a confrontation with a power that had long shaped the destiny of the steppe. The Jin dynasty, founded by the Yurshan people in the 12th century, had expanded rapidly and established themselves as rulers over northern China after defeating the Song. They had built a sophisticated state with bureaucratic institutions, fortified cities, and a formidable army. Their wealth was immense, supported by taxes from millions of farmers and revenues from bustling trade networks. To the Mongols, accustomed to a life of herding and mobility, the scale of Jin wealth was almost unimaginable. Yet wealth alone did not guarantee invulnerability. The Jin Empire, like many sedentary states, relied heavily on fortified cities, static defences, and the management of vast subject populations. Against a mobile, disciplined, and relentless enemy, these strengths could also become weaknesses. The conflict between the Mongols and the Jin began not with a single invasion, but with raids and skirmishes along the frontier. For generations, nomadic groups had raided Chinese borderlands, seizing goods and retreating before large armies could respond. What set Genghis Khan apart was his ambition to go beyond raids and to strike at the very foundations of Jin power. He sought not simply plunder, but conquest. Not a temporary gain, but a restructuring of the balance between steppe and sown. In 1211, the Mongols launched their first major campaign into Jin territory. Genghis Khan assembled an army of unprecedented size for the steppe, numbering perhaps 100,000 or more, drawn from the newly united Mongol tribes and their subject peoples. His generals, many of whom had risen through merit rather than noble birth, were seasoned in the discipline of his new system. The campaign was carefully planned. Scouts and intelligence networks provided information about Jin defences, while the mobility of the Mongol cavalry allowed them to choose when and where to strike. The Jin defensive strategy relied heavily on their Great Wall fortifications stretching across the northern frontier. Massive walls, towers and garrisons were intended to block nomadic incursions. Against ordinary raiders, these defences could be effective, but the Mongols were not ordinary raiders. They bypassed strong points, exploited gaps, and used their mobility to strike deep into Jin territory, outmanoeuvring the heavy infantry and slower-moving forces sent against them. When confronted directly, the Mongols employed feigned retreats, luring enemy armies into ambushes where they could be encircled and destroyed. One of the most striking features of the Mongol campaigns was their use of psychological warfare. They spread terror deliberately, slaughtering entire garrisons that resisted, and sending survivors fleeing to carry tales of Mongol ruthlessness. Cities that resisted could expect annihilation, while those that surrendered often received more lenient treatment. This reputation spread quickly through Jin territory, weakening resistance as communities debated whether defiance was worth the risk. Fear became as powerful a weapon as the bow. The battles of 1211 and 1212 were devastating for the Jin. Mongol forces crushed armies many times their size, demonstrating that mobility and discipline could overcome the traditional strengths of a sedentary empire. Entire provinces were thrown into chaos as Mongol cavalry swept through the countryside, burning fields, seizing grain, and capturing tens of thousands of people, who were then resettled or incorporated into the Mongol system. Craftsmen and artisans were especially prized. Instead of slaughtering them, the Mongols often spared skilled workers, sending them north to serve the needs of the expanding empire. In this way, the conquest of China became not only a military campaign, but also a means of transferring knowledge and technology to the steppe. The Jin dynasty attempted to respond by mobilizing massive armies, but their rigid structure and reliance on heavy infantry left them at a disadvantage. Time and again, Mongol horse archers outmaneuvered them, striking quickly and retreating before counterattacks could form. Siege warfare, however, presented a challenge. The Mongols were masters of the open field, but Chinese cities were protected by massive walls and fortifications. To overcome them, Genghis Khan employed a combination of strategies. Sometimes he bypassed fortified cities, leaving them isolated while he ravaged the countryside. At other times, he adopted techniques learned from captured engineers, using catapults, siege towers, and even early forms of gunpowder weapons to batter down defences. Each campaign expanded his arsenal of methods, blending nomadic mobility with the technology of sedentary states. The campaign against the Jin was not a single decisive war, but a series of incursions stretching over years. By 1213, the Mongols had penetrated deep into northern China, sacking cities and seizing vast quantities of supplies. They reached as far as the Jin capital of Zhongdu, the great city that later became Beijing. The siege of Zhongdu in 1215 was one of the most dramatic episodes of the war. The city was heavily fortified and garrisoned by tens of thousands of soldiers, with walls that had withstood attacks for centuries. Yet the Mongols encircled it, cutting off supplies and bombarding it with siege engines. After months of resistance, the city fell, and the slaughter was immense. Contemporary accounts describe rivers of blood and streets choked with corpses. The destruction of Zhongdu sent shockwaves throughout China. signalling that even the mightier strongholds could not withstand the Mongol onslaught. Despite these victories, the Mongols did not immediately conquer all of Jin territory. Their strategy was often to devastate and weaken, leaving pockets of resistance while consolidating gains elsewhere. This approach reflected both practical limitations and broader ambitions. The Mongols were still learning to govern cities and agricultural lands, and they had no desire to become bogged down in endless sieges when their mobility gave them other options. At the same time, Genghis Khan was already looking westward, towards Central Asia and the great cities of the Khwarezmian Empire. The Jin War remained unfinished, but the lesson was clear. The Mongols could humble one of the wealthiest empires of their age. For the people of northern China, the Mongol invasion was a catastrophe. Entire regions were depopulated, trade routes were disrupted, and famine spread as fields were burned and harvests lost. Refugees fled southward, swelling the territories of the southern Song dynasty. Yet amid the devastation, some communities submitted willingly, calculating that survival under Mongol rule was preferable to annihilation. These dynamics mirrored what had already happened on the steppe, where Genghis Khan's mixture of terror and reward had forged unity out of chaos. The war against the Jin also had profound consequences for the Mongols themselves. It exposed them to new forms of wealth, new technologies, and new administrative practices. Chinese engineers, artisans, and bureaucrats were incorporated into the Mongol system, teaching siegecraft, metallurgy, and techniques of governance. Genghis Khan was pragmatic, valuing usefulness over origin. Captured scholars and officials were not discarded but employed, contributing to the transformation of the Mongol Confederation from a purely nomadic army into the nucleus of a world empire. By the end of the first great campaign against the Jin, the balance of power in East Asia had shifted irreversibly. The Jin dynasty, once dominant and secure behind its walls and armies, was weakened, humiliated, and forced into a defensive posture. The Mongols, once dismissed as scattered nomads, had proven themselves a force capable of toppling cities, annihilating armies, and reshaping the political order of the region. The conquest of the steppe rivals had given Genghis Khan the base of power he needed, but the war against the Jin demonstrated what that power could achieve against one of the great civilizations of the age. By the second decade of the 13th century, Genghis Khan had already broken the power of the steppe rivals and humbled the Jin dynasty in northern China. Yet his ambitions were never limited to his immediate neighbours. His vision extended across the known world, and as his armies grew in strength and his empire in cohesion, the steppe ruler began to look westward, toward the rich cities and fertile lands of Central Asia. It was here, along the trade routes of the Silk Road, that wealth, cultures and religions converged, creating an arena of immense opportunity and danger. At the centre of this region stood the Khwarezmian Empire, a state that would soon learn the full weight of Mongol fury. The Khwarezmian Empire, ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad Dest, stretched across Persia, Transoxiana, and parts of modern-day Afghanistan and Iran. It was a relatively young power, having expanded rapidly in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, absorbing territories that had once been under the Seljuk Turks and other regional rulers. Its cities were legendary for their size and prosperity. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, and Nishapur were jewels of Islamic civilization, centres of learning, commerce, and architecture. Merchants from China, India, and the Middle East passed through these hubs, carrying goods, knowledge, and faiths across continents. For the Mongols, who had begun to recognize the value of controlling trade routes as well as pastures, Khwarezm represented not only an enemy, but also the key to global influence. Initially, Genghis Khan did not plan war against the Khwarezmians. He approached them with the logic of a statesman, seeking peaceful relations that could benefit both sides. He sent envoys and merchants to propose trade, offering to open the vast markets of China and the steppe to Khwarezmian goods. For a brief moment it seemed possible that an alliance could emerge between the nomadic conqueror and the sedentary empire. But suspicion, arrogance, and miscalculation destroyed this possibility. In 1218, a caravan of Mongol merchants, protected by Mongol envoys, arrived in the Khwarezmian city of Otrar. Instead of being welcomed, they were accused of spying. The governor of the city, acting either out of fear, greed, or a desire to assert independence, had them arrested and executed. When word reached Genghis Khan, he was furious but restrained. He sent a delegation of 3 ambassadors directly to the Shah, demanding punishment of the governor and restitution for the murdered merchants. The Shah, however, compounded the insult. He had one of the ambassadors killed and the others humiliated, their beards burned in an act of calculated disrespect. In the world of the steppe, where envoys were sacred, this was not only an affront but an act of war. The response of Genghis Khan was swift and absolute. He gathered his forces, numbering perhaps 150,000, and launched one of the most devastating campaigns in world history. Unlike the raids of earlier nomadic tribes, this was not a plundering expedition, but a deliberate war of annihilation against an empire that had insulted him. The Mongols moved with breathtaking speed, crossing deserts and mountain ranges that many thought impassable. Their mastery of logistics, their disciplined organization, and their use of intelligence networks allowed them to strike at the heart of Khwarezmian power before the Shah could mount a coherent defense. The first great target was Bukhara. In 1220, the Mongols descended upon the city, one of the richest in the Islamic world. Accounts describe how Genghis Khan entered the city after its capture and addressed the people directly, declaring himself the scourge of God sent to punish their ruler. The city was plundered, its treasures seized, its defenders executed. Many artisans and craftsmen were spared, relocated to serve Mongol needs elsewhere, while the general population suffered massacre and enslavement. Bukhara's fall sent a shockwave through the region, signalling that even the greatest of cities could not withstand the Mongol onslaught. From Bukhara, the Mongols advanced to Samarkand, another jewel of Central Asia. The Shah assembled a massive army, bolstered by foreign mercenaries and war elephants, but discipline and morale were weak. The Mongols, by contrast, employed deception and tactical brilliance. They feigned retreats, lured units into ambushes, and used their mobility to encircle the larger force. Samarkand fell after a brief but intense siege. Its defenders were slaughtered, its population decimated, its wealth carried off. Once again, skilled workers were spared and relocated, feeding the growing infrastructure of the Mongol Empire. As city after city fell, the Shah fled, abandoning his people. Pursued relentlessly by Mongol detachments, he sought refuge in distant corners of his realm, finally dying on an island in the Caspian Sea, broken and humiliated. His death symbolized the collapse of Khwarezmian power, but the Mongol vengeance was not yet complete. Genghis Khan sent his generals, Zubutai and Jebe, on a legendary expedition westward, chasing remnants of the Shah's forces across Persia and into the Caucasus. This campaign extended Mongol influence to the edges of the Islamic world and into the lands of the Rus, laying the groundwork for future conquests. The destruction of Khwarezm was catastrophic on a scale that stunned contemporaries. Cities such as Urgench and Nishapur were annihilated, their populations slaughtered in numbers that chroniclers estimated in the hundreds of thousands. While medieval figures are often exaggerated, the devastation was undeniably immense. Irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for centuries were destroyed, fields lay fallow, and once thriving centres of commerce were reduced to ruins. The brutality was deliberate. Genghis Khan sought not only to punish but to make an example, demonstrating to the world that betrayal of Mongol envoys would bring total destruction. At the same time, the campaign revealed the adaptability of the Mongols. They employed siege engines, engineers, and techniques learned from China and incorporated into their operations. They combined traditional steppe mobility with new forms of warfare suited to cities and fortifications. Their intelligence networks tracked enemy movements, while their discipline ensured that orders were carried out with precision. It was a synthesis of nomadic and sedentary military traditions, forged into a tool of unprecedented destructive power. For the Islamic world, the fall of Khwarazm was a trauma that echoed for generations. Scholars, poets, and chroniclers described the Mongols as a force of apocalypse, scourges unleashed upon humanity. Yet within the Mongol Empire, the campaign was remembered as a turning point. It extended their reach deep into Central Asia, secured control over key stretches of the Silk Road, and demonstrated that no power, no matter how wealthy or sophisticated, could defy them with impunity. The artisans, scholars, and administrators carried away from Khwarazm enriched the Mongol state, contributing skills that would be used in future conquests and governance. By the time the campaign ended, Khwarazm was shattered beyond repair. The Shah's dynasty was extinguished, the cities lay in ruins, and the survivors scattered. For Genghis Khan, it was proof that the empire he was building was not confined to the steppe or to China. It could reach across deserts and mountains, crushing any who opposed it. The conquest of Central Asia was not only a military triumph, but a declaration that the Mongols had become a world power, reshaping the destiny of continents. The Mongol conquest cannot be understood simply as a matter of luck, brutality, or numbers. Many nomadic confederations had risen before the Mongols, and many had swept across borders with sudden ferocity, only to fade as quickly as they appeared. What set Genghis Khan apart, what made his empire endure and expand beyond the expectations of friend and foe alike, was not just his charisma or his ruthlessness, but his deliberate innovations in both the military and in governance. He reshaped the culture of the steppe into a system that could sustain an empire, fusing traditions of nomadic life with new methods drawn from conquered peoples. It was this synthesis that transformed his armies into the most formidable military machine of their age, and it was this same vision that turned a confederation of clans into an organised state, capable of ruling vast and diverse populations. At the heart of his system was discipline. The Mongols had long been skilled horsemen and archers, but their power was limited by the structure of tribal society. Warriors tended to fight in family or clan groups, loyal to their own chiefs rather than to any central authority. This created fluid but unstable alliances, prone to fragmentation the moment fortune shifted. Genghis Khan broke this pattern. His decimal system, organising warriors into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, cut across kinship ties. Men from different clans were deliberately mixed together, ensuring that their primary loyalty was to their commander and ultimately to Genghis Khan himself. Commanders were chosen for ability rather than lineage, a radical break from the aristocratic traditions of the steppe. This created a chain of command that was meritocratic, disciplined, and cohesive. Training and discipline reinforced this structure. Mongol warriors were drilled not only in riding and archery, which they had mastered from childhood, but also in coordinated maneuvers, feigned retreats, encirclements, and communication across distances. Signals using flags, drums, and horns allowed large forces to move with precision, acting as a single organism rather than a collection of independent bands. The famed Mongol feigned retreat, in which a unit would appear to flee in panic, only to lure the enemy into an ambush, required extraordinary coordination and trust in leadership. Such tactics turned the mobility of the steppe horseman into a devastating weapon of deception and surprise. Logistics, often overlooked in accounts of warfare, were another sphere of Mongol innovation. The armies could cover vast distances at remarkable speed, sometimes moving up to 100 miles in a single day. This mobility was supported by an organised system of remounts. Each warrior typically had several horses, allowing them to switch mounts and prevent exhaustion. Herds moved with the army, providing milk, meat, and transport. Supplies were supplemented by careful planning and the seizure of local resources. When operating in distant lands, the Mongols relied on intelligence networks and scouts to ensure that routes of advance were secure and that forage and water were available. The capacity to sustain large armies deep inside enemy territory was one of the defining features of Mongol success. Siege warfare posed a different challenge. Nomadic armies were accustomed to fighting in the open, but cities with strong fortifications required new methods. Genghis Khan was quick to adapt. From Chinese engineers and captured specialists, he incorporated siege technologies such as catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, and siege towers. Later campaigns even employed early forms of gunpowder weapons. The Mongols became as adept at storming fortified cities as they were at manoeuvring in the open field. They often combined psychological warfare with siegecraft, using terror to induce surrender before prolonged resistance could form. Cities that opened their gates were often spared harsh treatment, while those that resisted could expect annihilation. This policy created a powerful incentive for compliance, saving Mongol resources while spreading their reputation as an unstoppable force. Intelligence and communication were equally crucial. Genghis Khan developed a network of spies and scouts that provided detailed information about enemy movements, terrain, and political divisions. These networks were supported by the Yam, a relay system of mounted couriers and stations that later expanded into a continental communication infrastructure. Messages could travel at remarkable speed across thousands of miles, allowing coordination between distant armies and swift responses to crises. The Yam also facilitated trade, governance, and the integration of conquered territories, making it one of the enduring institutions of the empire. Governance followed the same principles as the military: discipline, merit, and pragmatism. The Yasa, the legal code attributed to Genghis Khan, provided a framework for justice and order. While not a single written document, it represented a body of rules and precedents that governed everything from theft and adultery to the conduct of warfare and the obligations of subjects. The law was enforced strictly, applying to nobles and commoners alike. This universality distinguished Mongol rule from many earlier tribal systems, where the aristocracy enjoyed privileges beyond the reach of law. Under Genghis Khan, even powerful commanders could face punishment for disobedience or corruption. Religious tolerance was another innovation. The Mongol Empire encompassed a vast diversity of faiths, including shamanism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and Taoism. Genghis Khan himself followed the traditional shamanic practices of the steppe, but he recognized the importance of accommodating the beliefs of his subjects. Religious leaders were often granted exemptions from taxation and conscription, and temples, mosques, and churches were protected if they did not resist Mongol authority. This policy reduced resistance and allowed the empire to govern diverse populations with relative stability. Economic governance also reflected pragmatism. The Mongols recognized the value of trade and sought to protect merchants and caravans. The destruction of Khwarezm had opened vast stretches of the Silk Road to Mongol control, and Genghis Khan encouraged the flow of goods and ideas across his empire. The Yam system provided security for traders, while the strict enforcement of law reduced the dangers of banditry. By fostering commerce, the Mongols enriched themselves while also integrating the economies of Eurasia. One of Genghis Khan's most significant innovations was his use of talent from conquered peoples. He did not restrict positions of trust and authority to Mongols alone. Artisans, engineers, administrators, and scholars from across the empire were recruited into his service. Chinese engineers built siege engines, Muslim administrators managed finances and taxation, and Turkic soldiers filled the ranks of his armies. This cosmopolitan approach not only enhanced Mongol capabilities, but also fostered a sense of participation among subject peoples. The empire became not simply an extension of the steppe, but a fusion of traditions from across Eurasia, unified under the discipline of Mongol rule. Genghis Khan's style of leadership also played a role in his governance. He was known for rewarding loyalty and punishing betrayal with absolute consistency. Followers who served him faithfully could expect protection, wealth, and advancement, regardless of their birth. Conversely, those who betrayed him faced death, no matter their rank or past service. This clarity of reward and punishment created a culture of trust and fear that sustained the empire. His personal presence in battle, his willingness to share hardships with his men, and his pragmatic decision-making reinforced his image as a leader, chosen by the eternal blue sky to rule all under heaven. Taken together, these innovations explain the durability and reach of the Mongol Empire. It was not merely a horde of raiders, but a disciplined, organised and adaptable force, backed by a coherent system of governance. The fusion of steppe traditions with sedentary practices created an empire that could wage war across continents and rule over diverse peoples. Where other nomadic confederations had faltered after initial conquests, the Mongols built a state that lasted generations, reshaping the history of Eurasia. And yet, even as these systems were being established, Genghis Khan remained in constant motion, leading his armies into new campaigns, testing the strength of his innovations against the greatest powers of his age. His methods of warfare and governance were not static but evolving, shaped by the challenges he faced and the peoples he conquered. What emerged was a model of empire unlike any that had come before, one that blended the mobility of the nomad with the institutions of the city, and one that left an imprint still visible in the centuries that followed. By the early 1220s, Genghis Khan had achieved what no steppe ruler before him had ever accomplished. The tribes of Mongolia were united under his banner. The Jin dynasty of northern China was crippled, and the Khwarezmian Empire had been obliterated in a storm of blood and fire. Yet even with such achievements behind him, the great Khan was not content. His life was one of perpetual movement, and every conquest seemed only to open the horizon for another. His final years were marked by campaigns that pushed the boundaries of Mongol power to unprecedented limits, while also revealing the burdens of age, the strain of endless war, and the looming question of succession. The campaigns against the Khwarezmians had demonstrated the reach of Mongol arms, but Genghis Khan was not satisfied simply with their destruction. He sought to secure the western frontier of his empire and ensure that no remnant of resistance could rise again. To this end, he dispatched two of his greatest generals, Subutai and Jibei, on an expedition that has since become legendary. Their orders were to pursue the fleeing remnants of the Khwarezmian forces, harass them endlessly, and explore the lands that lay beyond. The journey carried them across Persia, into the Caucasus, and eventually as far as the steppes of the Rus. In the process, they fought and defeated a coalition of Georgian, Armenian and Kipchak forces, before finally clashing with the princes of Rus at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. Though Genghis Khan himself was far away, the campaign revealed the extraordinary capacity of the Mongol army to operate independently at great distances, striking terror into regions that had scarcely heard of the Mongols before. While his generals were extending his influence westward, Genghis Khan himself turned his gaze back to the east. The Jin dynasty, though battered, was not yet destroyed. They had retreated south of the Yellow River, regrouping and maintaining control over vast populations and resources. For Genghis Khan, unfinished business with the Jin was intolerable. In 1226, he launched a new campaign, this time against the Tangut kingdom of Western Xia, which had been a vassal state of the Jin, and at times an unreliable ally. The Tanguts had earlier refused to support the Mongols in their war against the Khwarezmians, a slight that Genghis Khan could neither forgive nor forget. The campaign against the Tanguts was ruthless. The Mongols descended upon their cities, overwhelming defences with siege engines and sheer persistence. Town after town fell, and the Tangut armies were broken. The capital was besieged, and though the Tangut rulers pleaded for mercy and offered submission, Genghis Khan pressed on. Chroniclers suggest that he demanded unconditional surrender, determined to erase the Tangut kingdom as a political entity. The final siege was brutal, the city falling under a storm of fire and slaughter. The Tangut dynasty was extinguished, its people scattered, and its lands absorbed into the Mongol Empire. It was one of the few occasions where Genghis Khan pursued total extermination of a dynasty, leaving little behind but ruins and memories of devastation. It was during this campaign, however, that fate caught up with the great Khan. The exact details of his death remain shrouded in mystery and legend. Some sources claim that he fell from his horse during a hunt or campaign and sustained fatal injuries. Others suggest that he died from illness or wounds suffered in battle. Later legends, embroidered over centuries, spoke of assassination or even supernatural causes, but the truth is likely more prosaic. By 1227, Genghis Khan was in his mid-60s, an advanced age for a man who had spent his life in the saddle, enduring the hardships of endless war. Whether from accident, illness, or the cumulative toll of a lifetime of campaigning, his body could no longer carry the burden of empire. When he died, his death was kept secret for a time, concealed from both allies and enemies to prevent unrest or opportunistic revolts. His body was taken back toward Mongolia for burial, though the location of his tomb remains one of history's enduring mysteries. According to tradition, those who accompanied the funeral cortege killed anyone they encountered to preserve the secrecy of the route, and when the burial was complete, the slaves who dug the grave were themselves executed. Legends even tell of a river being diverted to cover the site, ensuring that no trace would ever be found. Whatever the truth, the resting place of Genghis Khan has never been discovered, and perhaps never will be, hidden somewhere in the vastness of the steppe. The question of succession, long a concern for nomadic confederations, was settled before his death. Genghis Khan had designated his third son, Ogedei, as his heir, believing him to be the most capable of maintaining unity among his brothers and generals. The decision was not without controversy, as his other sons Yochi, Chagatai and Tolui each commanded their own followings and ambitions. Yet the authority of the great Khan was such that his choice was accepted, at least for the time being. With his death, the empire passed into the hands of his descendants, who would carry forward his vision of conquest and expand the Mongol domains to their greatest extent. Even in death, the legacy of Genghis Khan loomed over the world. To his followers, he was the supreme leader chosen by the eternal blue sky, a man whose conquests had united the tribes, humbled empires, and reshaped the map of Eurasia. To his enemies, he was remembered as a scourge, a destroyer whose armies left behind mountains of skulls and cities reduced to ash. Yet his true legacy lay in the systems he had created. The disciplined army, the meritocratic chain of command, the laws that bound together diverse peoples, and the vision of empire that transcended tribe and region. These institutions outlived him, guiding the Mongol state through further generations of conquest and rule. As news of his death eventually spread, the world took stock of the man who had risen from obscurity on the Mongolian steppe to become the master of half the known world. His campaigns had toppled dynasties, obliterated cities, and carried the terror of the Mongol name from the Yellow River to the Caspian Sea. Yet they had also opened the Silk Road to new exchanges, spread technologies and ideas across continents, and created a vast zone of relative stability under Mongol rule. The paradox of Genghis Khan was that he was both a destroyer and a creator, tearing down the old world to make room for the new. And so, in the year 1227, the life of the great Khan came to an end. His body was gone, his tomb hidden, but his empire lived on. His sons and grandsons would take up the mantle, carrying Mongol arms into Europe, the Middle East, and deeper into China. The age of Genghis Khan had ended, but the age of the Mongols was only beginning, a force that would shape history for centuries to come. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 brought an empire to a crossroads. The Mongols had never before commanded such vast lands, stretching from the Yellow River in China to the shores of the Caspian Sea. Yet the glue that held this enormous domain together had been the personal authority of the great Khan himself, the man who commanded absolute loyalty from generals and tribesmen alike. With his passing, the danger of fragmentation was very real. nomadic confederations of the past had often collapsed upon the death of a powerful leader, torn apart by rivalries among heirs and opportunism among ambitious chiefs. Genghis Khan had known this, and in his final years he took careful steps to prepare for succession, designating his third son, Ogedei, as his heir. But even with this decision, the transition of power was far from straightforward. The succession process in the Mongol world was not simply a matter of inheritance. Authority flowed through both lineage and consensus, requiring recognition at a Kurultai, the great assembly of chiefs, generals, and members of the royal family. Genghis Khan's choice of Ogedei was strategic. His eldest son Yoki, though capable, was a source of tension because of doubts about his legitimacy, stemming from his mother Berta's capture years earlier by the Merkits. Though Genghis Khan had insisted Yoki was his true son, whispers persisted, and the rift between Yoki and his brother Chagatai deepened with time. The animosity between them was so strong that it threatened to divide the empire if either were chosen as heir. By selecting Ogedei, known for his even temper and ability to mediate disputes, Genghis Khan sought to ensure stability. When the Kurultai assembled, the decision was ratified. Ogedei was raised to the position of Great Khan, inheriting the mantle of empire. Yet tensions did not vanish. Yoshi had already died by the time of Genghis Khan's death, but his sons, most notably Batu, retained great power in the western steppes. Chagatai too remained an influential figure, governing Central Asia with a strong hand. Each branch of the family commanded large territories, and Ogedei's task was to assert central authority while balancing the ambitions of his brothers and nephews. It was a delicate dance of politics, one that required not only military force but also the maintenance of alliances within the ruling family. Ogedei inherited an empire that was still expanding. The Jin dynasty in northern China remained a target, and the Mongol armies continued their relentless campaigns against it. In 1234, after years of sieges and devastation, the Jin dynasty finally collapsed, its last emperor driven to suicide as Mongol forces closed in. This victory secured northern China and provided the Mongols with immense wealth and resources. The conquest also opened the path to the Song dynasty in the south, though that conflict would unfold more fully in the reigns of later Khans. Under Ogedei, the Mongols also turned west once again, launching campaigns into the Middle East and Eastern Europe, pushing the boundaries of their empire ever farther. As ruler, Ogedei displayed qualities both similar to and different from his father. He lacked the raw charisma and ruthless willpower of Genghis Khan, but he possessed a pragmatic sense of governance and a willingness to delegate authority to skilled administrators and generals. He surrounded himself with capable advisors, many drawn from conquered peoples. Among them were Uyghur bureaucrats, Persian officials, and Chinese scholars who contributed to the administrative machinery of the empire. This cosmopolitan approach allowed the Mongols to govern lands far removed from the steppe, integrating diverse systems of taxation, record-keeping, and communication. Ogedei also invested in the infrastructure of empire. He expanded the Yam system of relay stations, ensuring that messages and orders could travel rapidly across the vast distances of Mongol domains. He ordered the construction of Karakorum, the first permanent capital of the Mongol Empire, located in the Orkhon Valley of Mongolia. While simple by the standards of the great cities of China or Persia, Karakorum symbolized the transformation of the Mongols from nomadic conquerors into rulers of a settled empire. Temples, palaces, and markets grew within its walls, reflecting the diversity of the empire's subjects. The capital became a hub of trade and diplomacy, where merchants from as far away as Europe and the Middle East mingled with Mongol nobles and foreign envoys. Yet the succession struggles were never entirely resolved. The divisions between the different branches of Genghis Khan's descendants simmered beneath the surface. Chagatai, though loyal to the principle of Mongol unity, remained wary of Ogedei's authority. Batu, ruling in the western steppes, would later assert his independence with greater force especially after Ögedei's death. For the time being, however, Ögedei managed to hold the empire together, balancing rival ambitions with diplomacy and the implicit threat of military power. The campaigns of Ögedei's reign further demonstrated the scale of Mongol ambition. In the early 1230s, Mongol forces pushed deeper into Persia, crushing resistance and extending their rule across the Middle East. At the same time, their armies advanced into Eastern Europe, led by Subutai and Batu. The invasions of Rus, Poland and Hungary shook the continent, as Mongol cavalry annihilated armies and burned cities that had stood for centuries. These campaigns revealed the continuing effectiveness of the military system built by Genghis Khan, but also the determination of his heirs to carry his vision into new lands. Ögedei himself, however, was not a man of ascetic discipline. He was known for his fondness for wine and celebration, habits that eventually took a toll on his health. Chroniclers describe him as generous and open-handed, a ruler who enjoyed rewarding his followers and maintaining the loyalty of his court through feasting and gifts. Yet this generosity was balanced by a strict enforcement of law and order. The yasa remained the guiding principle of governance, applied across the empire with consistency. Banditry, corruption, and betrayal were punished harshly, ensuring that the vast territories remained under firm control. By the time of Ögedei's death in 1241, the Mongol Empire was larger than ever before, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. His reign had consolidated the conquests of his father, expanded them in multiple directions, and established institutions that gave the empire a more permanent character. But his death also reopened the question of succession, once again threatening to fracture the unity that had been so carefully maintained. The rule of Ögedei thus marked both continuity and change. He was not the warrior king that his father had been, but he was the statesman who transformed the Mongol Empire from a confederation of tribes and conquests into a functioning state. His reign demonstrated that the empire could survive beyond the life of its founder, carried forward by institutions, administrators and generals, as much as by the charisma of a single leader. Yet the shadows of rivalry among Genghis Khan's descendants lingered, ready to resurface whenever the central authority weakened. The Mongol drive westward began as an extension of their campaigns against the Khwarezmian Empire, but it quickly grew into something larger. By the late 1230s, the Mongols had already tested the strength of distant lands with exploratory raids. The expedition of Subutai and Jibei in pursuit of Khwarezmian fugitives had carried Mongol arms as far as the steppes of the Rus and the Caucasus, where they had destroyed armies that vastly outnumbered them. That mission had revealed both the vulnerability of these regions and the logistical feasibility of Mongol operations so far from their home bases. When Ögedei assumed the throne, he and his generals saw the chance to bring these lands firmly under Mongol domination, securing their western frontiers and extending their influence into Europe itself. The first great targets were the principalities of Rus. In the 13th century, Rus was not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of competing city-states, each ruled by its own prince, frequently at odds with one another. Kiev, Vladimir, Novgorod, and many smaller towns formed a fractured landscape of rivalries, alliances and betrayals. This lack of unity made them vulnerable. When the Mongols began their campaign in 1237, led by Batu, the son of Yochi, and guided by the brilliant general Subutai, the Rus princes could not agree on a coordinated defence. Each sought to protect his own territory, often waiting to see where the Mongols would strike before committing forces. The Mongol assault was devastating. In the winter of 1237-1238, they descended upon the Principality of Ryazan. The city was besieged, its walls overwhelmed, its population massacred. Chroniclers describe flames consuming the wooden fortifications and the streets running red with blood. From Ryazan the Mongols swept northward, striking Vladimir, Suzdal and other towns. Vladimir, one of the most important centres of Rus power, was besieged and destroyed in early 1238. Its cathedral was burned, and many of its inhabitants killed or enslaved. The devastation shocked the Rus world, but the princes still failed to unify. Novgorod, spared by distance and geography, remained untouched for the moment, though its survival was more due to fortune than resistance. The Mongols returned again in 1239 and 1240, pressing their campaign deeper into Rus. This time, their target was Kiev, the old centre of Rus civilization. Once a thriving metropolis, by the 13th century it had already declined from its golden age, but it remained a symbol of prestige and authority. The Mongols besieged the city in late 1240, breaching its defences after a brutal assault. The city was sacked, its churches looted, its population slaughtered or enslaved. The fall of Kiev marked the end of the independent Rus principalities as significant powers. In their place arose the Mongol overlordship known as the Tatar yoke, under which the princes of Rus were reduced to vassals, required to pay tribute and submit to Mongol authority. This domination would last for generations, shaping the trajectory of Russian history long after the Mongol Empire itself had fractured. With Rus subdued, the Mongols turned their attention farther west. In 1241, their armies advanced into Poland and Hungary, lands that lay at the edge of Christendom. The timing was deliberate. The papacy was embroiled in political struggles, and the kingdoms of Europe were divided by their own rivalries. The Mongols exploited this disunity just as they had in Rus. Their forces advanced in multiple columns, spreading confusion and preventing any single European army from concentrating against them. In Poland, the Mongols clashed with a coalition of Polish knights, Teutonic Order warriors, and other allies at the Battle of Liegnitz in April 1241. Despite the courage of the defenders, the Mongol tactics of feigned retreat and encirclement proved decisive. The European cavalry, lured into pursuit, was enveloped and annihilated. Chroniclers described heaps of slain knights, their banners trampled into the mud, their cities left defenceless. The victory opened the path into the heart of Poland, though the Mongols didn't linger, for their main objective lay farther south. That objective was Hungary. King Balathorf had sought to resist Mongol expansion, offering refuge to the Cumans, a nomadic people fleeing the Mongol advance. This act made Hungary a target, as the Mongols viewed the Cumans as rebellious subjects. In March 1241, the Mongols crossed the Carpathian Mountains and invaded Hungary from multiple directions, their forces converging on the Hungarian plain. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Mohi, fought in April 1241 on the banks of the Sajo River. The Hungarian army, heavily armoured and reinforced by European knights, was confident in its strength. But the Mongols, under the command of Subutai, executed a masterful plan. They combined frontal assaults with flanking manoeuvres, used siege engines to bombard the Hungarian camp, and exploited their mobility to encircle the enemy. By dawn, the Hungarian army was trapped, its soldiers crushed between converging Mongol forces. The slaughter was immense, with tens of thousands killed and the kingdom left open to invasion. In the aftermath of Mohi, Hungary was devastated. Towns were burned, fields destroyed, and survivors scattered. The Mongols roamed across the kingdom, plundering and killing at will. Poland too suffered raids and destruction, as did parts of Austria and Croatia. Europe reeled in shock. Rumours spread of an unstoppable horde, a scourge from the east sent by God to punish Christendom for its sins. Panic gripped the continent, and desperate embassies were dispatched to seek information about the Mongols and to consider strategies of defence. Yet just as Europe braced for the possibility of total conquest, the Mongol armies suddenly withdrew in 1242. The reason for this retreat lay not in European resistance, but in events far away on the Mongolian steppe. News had reached Batu and Subutai of the death of Ugadei, the great Khan. According to custom, the princes of Genghis Khan's lineage were required to return to Mongolia for the election of a new ruler at a Kurultai. The unity of the empire depended on this ritual, and even in the midst of triumphant campaigns, the obligation could not be ignored. The withdrawal saved Europe from what might have been complete subjugation. but the memory of the Mongol invasion lingered, a reminder of how vulnerable even the most powerful kingdoms were to the discipline and mobility of steppe armies. The invasions of Rus, Poland and Hungary marked the high point of Mongol expansion into Europe. They demonstrated the effectiveness of Mongol military systems against the heavy cavalry and fortified towns of the West, just as they had against the cities of China and the Islamic world. They also revealed the adaptability of the Mongols, who adjusted their strategies to new terrains and new opponents without hesitation. For Europe, the shock was profound. The Mongols were no longer distant rumours, but a real and immediate threat, one that had shattered armies and reduced kingdoms to ashes. For the Mongols, the campaigns were proof that no frontier was beyond their reach, that the empire forged by Genghis Khan could project power across continents, humbling states that had long considered themselves secure behind mountains, rivers and fortresses. The Mongol thrust into the Middle East was as much about strategic necessity as it was about ambition. After the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire, the Mongols had left behind a fractured region filled with displaced rulers, restless tribes, and shifting allegiances. Some of the Khwarezmian remnants had fled to the Middle East, harassing territories along the borders of the Mongol domains. At the same time, the wealth of the Islamic world, its cities, its trade routes, its dynasties, beckoned to the Mongol leadership. With the westward expansion under Batu halting temporarily after the withdrawal from Europe in 1242, attention turned southward toward Persia and beyond, where the successors of Genghis Khan would press their campaigns deeper into lands that had once been the beating heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. The initial campaigns fell under the direction of Hulagu, a grandson of Genghis Khan, who was given command of a vast army with the mission of subduing the Islamic states of the Middle East. The campaign was part of a broader strategy devised at the court of the great Khan Möngke, who sought to secure the empire's frontiers and eliminate centres of resistance. Hulag's force was immense, perhaps one of the largest Mongol armies ever assembled, incorporating not only Mongol warriors but also contingents of subject peoples, Turks, Persians, Chinese engineers, and even Christian auxiliaries from Armenia and Georgia, who saw the Mongols as potential allies against their Muslim rivals. The Mongols advanced first into Persia, crushing what remained of resistance there. Fortresses that had stood for centuries fell one by one. Among the most famous were the strongholds of the Nizari Ismailis, often referred to in European chronicles as the Assassins. These mountain fortresses, perched high in the rugged terrain of Iran, had long resisted conquest, their warriors notorious for targeted killings of political and religious leaders. The Mongols, however, brought siege technologies and overwhelming force. Castle after castle was reduced, and in 1256 the legendary fortress of Alamut surrendered, its libraries and treasures falling into Mongol hands. The destruction of the Nizaris removed one of the region's most enigmatic powers, clearing the way for further conquest. With Persia subdued, Hulagu turned his attention to Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. Though the Abbasids had long since lost the political dominance they enjoyed in the early centuries of Islam, Baghdad remained a symbol of immense importance. Founded in the 8th century, it had been the centre of the Islamic world, a hub of learning, trade and culture. By the 13th century, its caliphs were largely figureheads, overshadowed by regional powers, but their religious authority still carried weight across the Muslim world. To bring down Baghdad was not merely a military victory, it was a blow aimed at the very heart of Islamic civilization. In 1258, the Mongols laid siege to the city. Hulagu's forces surrounded Baghdad, cutting off supplies and bombarding the walls with siege engines. The defenders fought desperately, but the city was unprepared for the scale of the assault. Contemporary accounts describe a sense of doom that hung over the city as Mongol forces closed in. The Caliph, Al-Mustasim, hesitated, failing to mount a coordinated defence or rally allies in time. After a brief but intense siege, the walls were breached, and the Mongols poured into the city. What followed was one of the most infamous episodes in world history, Baghdad, once called the City of Peace, was engulfed in fire and blood. The Mongols slaughtered tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, though medieval chroniclers often exaggerated numbers. Libraries, including the famed House of Wisdom, were looted and burned, with legends claiming that the Tigris River ran black with ink from countless manuscripts and red with the blood of scholars. Palaces, mosques, and markets were destroyed, and the grandeur of Baghdad was reduced to rubble. The caliph himself was captured and executed, an act that symbolized the end of Abbasid authority in its historic seat. For the Islamic world, the fall of Baghdad was a shock of immense proportions, the destruction of a city that had stood for centuries as a beacon of culture and faith. Yet the Mongols were not indiscriminate destroyers. While the sack of Baghdad was catastrophic, Hulagu sought to consolidate control over his new territories. He established what came to be known as the Khanate, a Mongol state centred in Persia and Mesopotamia. This polity would endure for generations, blending Mongol traditions with Persian administrative systems. Though initially antagonistic to the broader Muslim world, the Khanate would eventually adopt Islam, further integrating itself into the cultural fabric of the region. But at the moment of its creation, it was seen as a brutal rupture, the replacement of an Islamic dynasty with the authority of steppe conquerors. The fall of Baghdad also brought the Mongols into direct conflict with other Islamic powers. To the west lay the Mamluks of Egypt, a military elite of slave soldiers who had seized power and established a formidable state. The Mongols, emboldened by their conquest of Baghdad, sought to extend their domination into Syria and beyond. Aleppo and Damascus fell under Mongol control, their cities subdued and their populations brought under Mongol administration. The advance seemed unstoppable, and many believed the entire Middle East would soon fall under Hulagu's authority. But events would intervene. In 1260, while Hulagu withdrew part of his forces eastward due to the death of Genghis Khan and the need to attend to succession disputes, the Mamluks seized the moment. At the Battle of Ain Jalut, in the hills of Galilee, the Mamluks confronted a smaller Mongol contingent. Using tactics that echoed those of the steppe, feigned retreats, rapid cavalry maneuvers, the Mamluks achieved a stunning victory. For the first time, a Mongol army was decisively defeated in open battle. Ain Jalut halted the Mongol advance into Egypt and marked the beginning of a new balance of power in the Middle East, with the Mamluks positioning themselves as defenders of Islam against the Mongol threat. The Mongol presence in the Middle East, however, was not erased. The Khanate endured, ruling Persia, Iraq, and parts of the Caucasus for nearly a century. Over time, its rulers converted to Islam, patronized Persian culture, and contributed to the region's intellectual and artistic life. The sack of Baghdad remained a wound that could not be forgotten, but the Mongol impact on the Middle East was not solely one of destruction. It reshaped the political map, altered the course of Islamic history, and demonstrated once again the extraordinary reach of the empire built by Genghis Khan and his heirs. The destruction of the Abbasids in Baghdad stands as one of the defining moments of the 13th century, a turning point where the old world of Islamic dominance met the unstoppable force of steppe conquest. For contemporaries, it was a catastrophe, a divine punishment, or an unimaginable tragedy. For the Mongols, it was another step in their relentless expansion, the absorption of yet another centre of power into the orbit of their empire. And yet, even as they reached such heights of conquest, the Mongols faced new challenges, enemies who adapted to their tactics, rivalries within their own dynastic house, and the difficulties of ruling lands far removed from the steppes that had shaped them. The conquest of northern China by Genghis Khan and his successors had brought down the Jin dynasty, but the task of subduing the entire Chinese world remained unfinished. The Song dynasty in the south still held vast populations, wealthy cities, and fertile lands that were far beyond the reach of any nomadic confederation that had come before. For the Mongols, the conquest of China represented both an extraordinary challenge and an irresistible prize. It would require adaptation, persistence, and the emergence of new leadership capable not only of defeating Chinese armies, but also of ruling one of the most complex societies on Earth. Out of this crucible of conquest and governance rose Kublai, grandson of Genghis Khan, whose rule would mark the transformation of the Mongols from conquerors of the steppe into emperors of China. Kublai was born in 1215, during the height of Genghis Khan's campaigns against the Jin. Unlike many of his cousins, who were raised entirely within the traditions of the steppe, Kublai grew up exposed to Chinese culture from an early age. His education included not only the martial training expected of a Mongol prince, but also instruction from Confucian scholars, Buddhist monks, and other advisors who introduced him to the intricacies of Chinese governance and philosophy. This exposure shaped his worldview, giving him a broader sense of statecraft than most of his kin. He admired the administrative systems of China, the sophistication of its cities, and the legacy of dynastic rule that had endured for centuries. Yet he also remained a product of the steppe, steeped in the traditions of mobility, military discipline, and loyalty to the house of Genghis Khan. As the empire of the Mongols expanded after Genghis Khan's death, Kublai emerged as a figure of growing importance. Under his brother Mungke, who became Great Khan in 1251, Kublai was assigned responsibility for overseeing Mongol territories in northern China. This role placed him at the centre of one of the most critical frontiers of the empire. He proved himself a capable administrator, appointing advisors from various backgrounds and seeking to integrate Chinese officials into the Mongol system. He encouraged agriculture, reduced excessive taxation, and worked to win the support of the local population, recognizing that conquest alone could not secure Mongol rule. His policies distinguished him from other Mongol princes, some of whom governed with heavy-handed extraction and little regard for Chinese traditions. Kublai's ambitions, however, were not confined to administration. He sought to extend Mongol power over the Song dynasty in the south, whose wealth and resources were unparalleled. The Song, though militarily weaker than the northern dynasties that had preceded them, were resilient, relying on fortified cities, rivers, and naval strength to defend their realm. For decades, they had resisted nomadic incursions, maintaining their hold over the fertile Yangtze Basin and the bustling commercial centres of Hangzhou and beyond. To bring down the Song would require not only brute force, but also careful strategy and adaptation to a style of warfare unfamiliar to the Mongols. Mungke Khan launched a major campaign against the Song in the 1250s, and Kublai played a central role in these efforts. The campaigns were difficult, marked by sieges, river battles, and the challenges of fighting in terrain far different from the open steppes. The Mongols, accustomed to swift cavalry manoeuvres, had to learn siegecraft on a massive scale, adapt to naval warfare, and sustain long campaigns in humid subtropical climates. Progress was slow and resistance fierce. During this time, Kublai gained invaluable experience in the complexities of Chinese warfare, as well as in the difficulties of ruling conquered populations. The turning point in Kublai's rise came after the death of Mungke in 1259. The sudden loss of the Great Khan reopened the succession disputes that had haunted the Mongol family since the time of Genghis. Kublai and his brother Arik-Buke both claimed the right to succeed, leading to a civil war that split the empire. Kublai, backed by his power base in China and supported by many of the eastern Mongol factions, declared himself Great Khan in 1260. Arik-Buke, supported by more traditionalist elements of the Mongol aristocracy centred in Mongolia itself, challenged him. The war that followed was not merely a dynastic struggle, but also a clash of visions. Arik-Buke represented the steppe-centred traditions of Mongol life, while Kublai embraced a more Sinicized model of empire, oriented toward the wealth and stability of China. After several years of conflict, Kublai emerged victorious. Arik-Buke was forced to surrender in 1264, and though divisions within the empire remained, Kublai secured his authority over the eastern half of the Mongol domains. His decision to establish his capital at Khanbalik, the city later known as Beijing, symbolized his orientation toward China. From there, he ruled not as a Khan of the steppe alone, but as an emperor in the Chinese tradition, adopting dynastic titles and integrating Chinese bureaucratic practices into his government. In 1271, he formally proclaimed the founding of the Yuan dynasty, presenting himself as the legitimate successor to centuries of Chinese imperial rule. The conquest of the Song dynasty remained Kublai's central military objective. Through prolonged campaigns, the Mongols pressed deeper into Song territory, overcoming fortresses and adapting their strategies. They built large fleets, employing both Chinese and foreign shipbuilders, to contest control of the rivers and coasts. The decisive moment came in 1276 with the capture of Hangzhou, the Song capital. The child emperor was taken captive, and though resistance continued in the south for several years, the dynasty was effectively finished. By 1279, the last remnants of Song resistance were crushed at the naval Battle of Yamen, where the loyalist fleet was annihilated and the young emperor drowned. With this, Kublai completed the conquest of China, unifying the country under Mongol rule for the first time in history. Kublai Khan's reign represented both continuity and transformation. He maintained the Mongol emphasis on military discipline, mobility, and loyalty to the House of Genghis, but he also embraced the institutions and traditions of China. His Yuan dynasty employed Chinese officials, adopted aspects of Confucian ideology, and sought to present itself as a legitimate Chinese dynasty, even as it remained distinct in its Mongol identity. The blending of cultures under Kublai's rule created a unique political order, one that fascinated foreign observers such as Marco Polo, who would later describe the magnificence of the Yuan court. Yet Kublai's rise also highlighted the fractures within the broader Mongol Empire. While he secured dominance in China, other branches of the family ruled in Persia, Central Asia, and the Western steppes, often pursuing their own agendas. The unity forged by Genghis Khan had splintered into distinct khanates, each claiming legitimacy but increasingly independent. Kublai's authority as Great Khan was acknowledged in name, but in practice his power extended primarily over China and its neighbouring regions. The story of Kublai's rise, then, is one of transformation. From a Mongol prince raised on the traditions of the steppe, he became the ruler of one of the greatest empires in Chinese history. His reign marked the culmination of Mongol conquest in the east and the beginning of a new era, where nomadic conquerors ruled as emperors, reshaping the destiny of China while redefining what it meant to be Mongol in a world no longer bound to the open grasslands. When Kublai Khan declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty in 1271, it marked a profound transformation, not only for China, but for the Mongol Empire as a whole. For the first time, the descendants of Genghis Khan were no longer simply conquerors from the steppe, but emperors of one of the world's oldest and most sophisticated civilizations. The proclamation of a new dynasty, complete with the dynastic name in the Chinese tradition, signalled that Kublai sought to rule not merely as a foreign overlord, but as the legitimate heir to centuries of imperial authority. It was a deliberate act of political theatre, meant to bind the Mongols into the long tradition of Chinese statehood, while at the same time reminding all that this was a dynasty born of conquest, led by a ruler whose origins lay far beyond the Great Wall. The Yuan dynasty was unique from its inception. Unlike the earlier dynasties that traced their roots back through Chinese history, the Yuan was an empire imposed from without. Its rulers were nomadic warriors whose power rested on their mastery of cavalry, their conquest of vast territories, and their claim to the legacy of Genghis Khan. Yet in China, they faced challenges that the steppe could not prepare them for. To govern such a large and diverse population, they had to create systems of administration, taxation, and law capable of managing millions of subjects who lived in cities, farmed in river valleys, and followed traditions of governance that stretched back 2,000 years. The Mongols adapted, but they also imposed new structures that reflected their identity as conquerors. One of the most striking features of Yuan governance was its system of ethnic hierarchy. Kublai and his successors divided their subjects into categories, with the Mongols themselves at the top. Below them came the Zemiran, or various sorts, which included Central Asians, Persians, and other peoples who had joined the Mongol armies or served in the empire's bureaucracy. Below them were the Hanren, the inhabitants of northern China, many of whom had lived under the Jin dynasty and were considered somewhat assimilated into nomadic rule. At the bottom were the Nanren, or Southerners, the people of the former Song dynasty, who were viewed with suspicion as the most recently conquered. This hierarchy determined not only one's status, but also access to government positions, privileges, and justice. It reinforced the dominance of the Mongol elite while creating resentment among the Chinese majority, who found themselves subject to discrimination in their own land. Despite these divisions, the Yuan dynasty invested heavily in consolidating its rule. The construction of a permanent capital at Khanbalik, later Beijing, symbolized the new order. The city was built with walls, palaces, temples, and markets, reflecting both Mongol and Chinese influences. It became a cosmopolitan hub, drawing merchants from Central Asia, envoys from Europe, and scholars from across the Islamic world. The Mongols encouraged trade, maintaining the safety of the Silk Road and ensuring that goods flowed freely between East and West. Under their rule, foreign travellers found unprecedented access to the Chinese world. The most famous of these was Marco Polo, who would later describe in Europe the wealth, sophistication, and sheer scale of the Yuan court, captivating audiences who had scarcely imagined such a realm. Economically, the Yuan dynasty inherited both strengths and difficulties. The fertile lands of southern China provided immense agricultural output, and the integration of northern and southern regions created opportunities for large-scale trade within the empire. The Mongols introduced paper currency on a massive scale, seeking to facilitate commerce and standardize transactions across their territories. But this innovation also created problems, as overissuance of paper money and the challenge of maintaining public confidence led to periods of inflation and instability. Taxation remained a constant burden, particularly on the peasantry, who often faced exploitation by corrupt officials and tax farmers. The tension between the needs of the Mongol elite and the capacity of the agricultural base to support them became a recurring issue. Culturally, the Yuan dynasty was both open and restrictive. On the one hand, it brought together influences from across the Mongol Empire, blending Chinese, Persian, Islamic, and steppe traditions. Scholars and artisans from afar enriched the cultural life of China, introducing new technologies, artistic styles, and scientific knowledge. On the other hand, the Yuan court often limited the advancement of native Chinese scholars within the bureaucracy, preferring to rely on foreigners or Mongols themselves. The traditional Confucian examination system, which had long provided access to government service, was restricted, leaving many Chinese elites excluded from official positions. This fostered resentment and a sense of alienation among the literati, who viewed Mongol rule as foreign domination rather than legitimate dynasty. Militarily, the Yuan faced constant challenges. The conquest of China had not ended warfare. Resistance continued in the south and along the coasts, where loyalists of the Song dynasty occasionally rose in rebellion. Beyond China's borders, the Mongols engaged in campaigns that stretched their resources. Kublai launched invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281, sending large fleets across the sea, only to be repelled by storms and determined defenders. These failed invasions not only drained the treasury but also undermined the aura of invincibility that the Mongols had cultivated. Other campaigns in Southeast Asia against kingdoms such as Jai Viet and Pagan met with limited success, often bogged down in unfamiliar terrain where cavalry mobility was less effective. Even within the Yuan court, divisions simmered. The question of identity, whether the Mongols should fully embrace Chinese traditions or maintain their distinct steppe heritage, created tensions. Kublai himself adopted many elements of Chinese governance and culture, but later rulers sometimes struggled with this balance. Some leaned more heavily toward Mongol traditions, alienating their Chinese subjects, while others attempted to adopt Chinese models more thoroughly, losing the loyalty of the Mongol aristocracy. The dynasty existed in a state of cultural negotiation, constantly balancing between the legacy of conquest and the demands of rule over an ancient and sophisticated society. Despite these difficulties, the Yuan dynasty left a lasting imprint on China. Its patronage of trade fostered an interconnected world that stretched from Europe to East Asia. Its capital at Khanbalik laid the foundations for Beijing as a political centre that would endure for centuries. Its experiments with paper currency, though fraught with challenges, anticipated developments in later dynasties, and its unique blend of cultures enriched the Chinese world, leaving traces in art, architecture and thought. Yet the very features that made the Yuan distinctive also ensured its fragility. The reliance on ethnic hierarchy alienated the majority, economic pressures strained the state, and military overreach drained its resources. The Yuan dynasty was the Mongols' attempt to transform conquest into enduring rule, to turn a nomadic empire into a settled dynasty. It succeeded for nearly a century, holding together one of the largest realms in Chinese history. But beneath the grandeur of the Yuan court and the reach of its armies, the seeds of discontent and rebellion were already present, waiting for the moment when weakness at the top would allow them to erupt. The Mongol conquest of Persia had begun in the campaigns of Genghis Khan, and continued with devastating effect under his successors. Cities were besieged, fortresses demolished, and entire regions reduced to ruin as the Mongol armies passed through. By the middle of the 13th century, much of Persia lay under Mongol influence, but the task of establishing stable governance remained. This was the mission given to Hulagu, the grandson of Genghis, who marched westward with one of the largest armies ever assembled under the empire's banner. His conquests, culminating in the fall of Baghdad and the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate, laid the foundation for a new Mongol polity in the Islamic world, a realm that would come to be known as the Ilkhanate. The Ilkhanate was established as one of the four great successor states of the Mongol Empire, alongside the Yuan dynasty in China, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde on the steppes of Russia. Its lands stretched across Persia, Mesopotamia, parts of Anatolia, and the Caucasus, encompassing a territory that was both strategically vital and culturally rich. Hulagu and his descendants ruled from Tabriz and later other cities, adapting Mongol traditions to the realities of governing an ancient and urbanized society. The word Ilkhan itself, meaning subordinate Khan, reflected their nominal loyalty to the Great Khan in the east, though in practice the Ilkhans exercised independent authority over their domains. At its core, the Ilkhanate was a product of conquest, and its early years were marked by violence and upheaval. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 remained etched in memory as one of the most catastrophic events in Islamic history. Libraries, mosques and palaces were destroyed, and the caliphate itself extinguished. In the years that followed, other cities across the region suffered a similar fate, though some, recognizing the futility of resistance, submitted to Mongol rule and were spared wholesale destruction. For the people of Persia, the arrival of the Ilkhans represented both the end of centuries of Islamic political supremacy and the beginning of an uncertain new order under foreign rulers. Hulagu sought to consolidate his realm by combining Mongol military dominance with elements of local administration. Persian bureaucrats, many of whom had served previous dynasties, were brought into the Ilkhanate government. These officials provided the expertise necessary to manage taxation, agriculture and urban affairs, areas in which the nomadic traditions of the Mongols offered little guidance. The partnership between Mongol rulers and Persian administrators created a hybrid system, where Mongol authority was asserted through military power and dynastic legitimacy, while the day-to-day functioning of the state depended on the knowledge and skills of local elites. Religious policy in the Ilkhanate reflected both pragmatism and change. Hulagu himself was sympathetic to Buddhism and maintained close ties with Nestorian Christianity, which had a strong presence among the Mongols and their allies in Armenia and Georgia. Early on, the Ilkhans were seen as potential allies by Christian powers who hoped to harness Mongol strength in renewed crusades against Muslim rivals. Envoys travelled between the Ilkhanate and European courts, and there was serious discussion of joint campaigns. Yet as time passed, the Ilkhans gradually moved toward Islam. The decisive shift came under Ghazan, who converted to Islam in 1295. His conversion transformed the Ilkhanate's religious identity, aligning it with the faith of its subjects and reshaping its political legitimacy. From then on, the Ilkhanate presented itself as an Islamic dynasty, even as it retained its Mongol heritage. Ghazan's reign marked a turning point in the history of the Ilkhanate. He undertook wide-ranging reforms designed to stabilize the state and restore prosperity to lands devastated by decades of war. Taxation was reorganized, abuses by officials curbed, and efforts made to encourage agriculture and rebuild irrigation systems. Ghazan also patronized the arts and sciences, sponsoring the construction of observatories, libraries, and mosques. Under his rule, the Ilkhanate became not merely a realm of conquerors, but a center of cultural and intellectual life, bridging the traditions of the Mongol steppe and the Persian Islamic world. Yet challenges persisted. The Ilkhanate faced constant pressure from its neighbours, particularly the Mamluks of Egypt, who had defeated a Mongol army at Ain Jalut in 1260 and remained a formidable rival. Repeated campaigns against the Mamluks failed to achieve decisive victory, draining the resources of the Ilkhans. To the north, conflicts with the Golden Horde strained relations within the Mongol family itself, as rival khanates competed for influence and territory. The unity of the empire, once proclaimed by Genghis Khan, had long since fractured, and the Ilkhanate was both a product and a participant in these divisions. Economically, the Ilkhanate's fortunes fluctuated. The Silk Road ran through its territories, bringing wealth through trade, but the disruption of agriculture during the Mongol conquests had lasting consequences. Many regions struggled with depopulation and ruined infrastructure. Ghazan's reforms alleviated some of these issues, but later rulers proved less capable. Fiscal difficulties mounted, particularly as the demands of war and courtly extravagance grew. Attempts to issue paper money, modelled on the Yuan dynasty in China, failed disastrously in Persia, where merchants and the population resisted its use, preferring silver and gold. The result was economic instability that weakened the state further. Culturally, however, the Ilkhanate left a profound mark. The blending of Mongol, Persian, and Islamic influences produced a flowering of art, architecture, and scholarship. Manuscripts were illuminated with intricate designs, monuments constructed that combined steppe motifs with Persian aesthetics, and scholars engaged in exchanges of knowledge that drew upon traditions from across the Mongol world. The historian Rashid al-Din, serving at the Ilkhanid court, compiled his monumental Compendium of Chronicles, one of the most important historical works of the medieval period, documenting not only the history of the Mongols, but also the cultures and peoples of Eurasia. Despite these achievements, the Ilkhanate remained vulnerable. After the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335, the dynasty fell into crisis. Without a strong heir, the state fragmented, and rival factions vied for power. Local warlords, governors, and tribal leaders carved out their own domains, and the once mighty Ilkhanate disintegrated into a patchwork of competing principalities. The legacy of Mongol rule endured in Persian culture and politics, but the unified authority of the Ilkhans was gone. The Mongol presence in Persia had reshaped the region in profound ways. The destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate ended an era of Islamic unity and replaced it with a new political order. The reforms of Ghazan and the cultural patronage of the Ilkhans left a legacy of integration between Mongol and Persian traditions. Yet the fragility of their state revealed the difficulties of transforming conquest into stable governance. Persia became, under the Ilkhans, both a centre of innovation and a realm of chronic instability, reflecting the paradox of Mongol rule itself: immense power, capable of remaking worlds, and yet vulnerable to the very divisions and pressures that conquest had unleashed. The Mongol expansion into Eastern Europe had begun in the time of Genghis Khan, when his generals pushed westward through the steppes and forests that stretched beyond the Caspian Sea. The great campaign of 1237 to 1242 under Batu, the son of Yochi and grandson of Genghis, had devastated the principalities of Rus and carried Mongol armies deep into Poland and Hungary. Cities were burned, populations displaced, and entire kingdoms shaken to their foundations by the sudden arrival of a power unlike anything they had faced before. Though the Mongols withdrew after the death of the great Khan Ogedei in 1241, their presence on the western steppes remained, and out of this presence grew a new Mongol state, the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde took its name from the camp of Batu Khan, whose headquarters were marked by a gilded tent that symbolized the authority of the Yochid line. Centered on the lower Volga River, with its capital later established at Sarai, the Golden Horde commanded an immense territory, stretching from the Carpathian Mountains to the steppes of Siberia and from the Black Sea to the Ural Mountains. This was a realm of grasslands, forests and rivers, where nomadic traditions merged with the realities of ruling over sedentary peoples. Its population was a mix of Turkic and Mongol nomads, Slavic peasants, and merchants from across Eurasia. The Horde was at once a steppe confederation and a successor state to the empire of Genghis Khan, carrying forward both the martial traditions of the Mongols and the complexities of administering conquered lands. For the Rus principalities, the arrival of the Golden Horde meant the beginning of a new political order. The princes of Rus were compelled to recognize the authority of the Khans, travelling to Sarai to receive yarliks, or charters of authority, that legitimized their rule. These charters were granted in exchange for loyalty, tribute and military service when required. While the Rus retained a measure of autonomy in their local affairs, they remained subject to the overlordship of the Horde. This arrangement fostered both resentment and adaptation. On one hand, the Mongol invasions had brought enormous destruction, reducing cities like Kiev to shadows of their former selves. On the other hand, the discipline of Mongol administration and the demands of tribute collection helped to shape the emerging political structures of the Rus, particularly in Moscow, which would rise over time as the foremost principality, in part due to its role as a reliable collector of tribute for the Horde. The Golden Horde maintained its power through a combination of military strength, economic control, and diplomacy. Its cavalry remained formidable, capable of launching devastating raids into Eastern Europe whenever resistance stirred. Its control over trade routes across the steppes and along the Volga gave it immense wealth. As merchants from China, Persia and Europe passed through its territories, Sarai itself became a cosmopolitan city, a hub of commerce where goods from across Eurasia were exchanged. The Horde also maintained close relations with other Mongol successor states, though rivalries often flared, particularly with the Ilkhanate in Persia, with whom it clashed repeatedly over control of the Caucasus. Religion within the Golden Horde evolved over time. The early Khans followed the shamanistic and Buddhist traditions of the Mongols, while also tolerating Christianity and Islam among their subjects. Over the course of the 14th century, however, Islam gained increasing influence, particularly under Khan Uzbeg, who converted and made Islam the official religion of the Horde. This transformation had profound effects, aligning the Golden Horde with the wider Islamic world and integrating it more deeply into the cultural networks of the Middle East. It also influenced the governance of the Horde, as Islamic law and institutions began to shape its administration. The Golden Horde's influence over Eastern Europe was profound and lasting. For nearly 2 centuries, the Rus principalities remained under its shadow, paying tribute and shaping their policies in response to the demands of the Khans. The Mongol impact can be seen in the centralization of power, the development of taxation systems, and the militarization of Rus society. While some later chroniclers depicted Mongol rule as an unmitigated disaster, it also provided the conditions under which Moscow could rise, eventually leading the resistance that would break the Horde's grip in the 15th century. Yet the horde was not immune to the same pressures that weakened other Mongol successor states. Internal rivalries, succession disputes, and conflicts with neighbours eroded its strength. The Black Death in the mid-14th century devastated its population and disrupted its economy. The rise of powerful neighbours, including the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the ascendant Moscow, challenged its authority. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, the Golden Horde fragmented into smaller khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, and others, each claiming a share of its legacy but lacking the unity of the past. The Golden Horde represented both continuity and change. It preserved the traditions of Mongol conquest, maintaining military supremacy over vast lands and shaping the politics of Eastern Europe. At the same time, it adapted to local conditions, embracing Islam, fostering trade, and ruling over a diverse and complex population. Its legacy endured long after its political power faded, leaving an imprint on the development of Russia, the geopolitics of the steppe, and the broader history of Eurasia. For the people who lived under its rule, the Horde was both a source of fear and a framework of order, a reminder that the conquests of Genghis Khan had reshaped the world far beyond the grasslands where they began. The vast territories of Central Asia, stretching from the deserts of Transoxiana to the mountains of the Tian Shan and the valleys that fed into Persia and India, fell under the dominion of Genghis Khan during his lifetime. When he divided his empire among his sons, this core of Central Asia was assigned to Chagatai, his second son. The lands he inherited were both strategic and turbulent. They sat at the crossroads of the Silk Road, linking China with Persia, India and the steppes, but they also contained deep divisions among nomadic tribes, urban populations and diverse faiths. From the outset, the Chagatai Khanate embodied the tensions inherent in Mongol rule, the balance between nomadic traditions and sedentary societies, the inheritance of Genghis Khan's authority, and the struggle to maintain unity in a region defined by fragmentation. Chagatai himself was a fierce defender of Mongol traditions. Known for his strict adherence to the Yasa, the legal code attributed to his father, he enforced discipline with a severity that became his hallmark. Under his leadership, the Khanate was initially a continuation of Mongol conquest, maintaining the dominance of the steppe aristocracy over the cities and farmlands of Central Asia. But after his death in 1242, the Khanate soon entered a period of instability. Successors lacked his authority, and the region became a stage for competing factions within the Mongol family. Unlike the Ilkhanate, which found stability under Ghazan, or the Golden Horde, which consolidated under Batu, the Chagatai Khanate remained fractured, its rulers struggling to assert control over both nomadic clans and urban elites. The geography of the Khanate made unity difficult. The western regions around Samarkand and Bukhara were centres of Islamic culture, urban life and trade, while the eastern areas in the Ili Valley and the steppes of Moghulistan were dominated by nomadic pastoralists. These zones required different styles of governance, and the Khans were often caught between the demands of the steppe aristocracy and the needs of the settled populations. The result was a cycle of tension, where one faction gained dominance only to alienate the other, leading to renewed conflict. Religion became one of the sharpest lines of division. The cities of Transoxiana were overwhelmingly Muslim, with deep traditions of Islamic scholarship and law. The Mongol elite, however, clung to shamanistic practices, Buddhism, or later Nestorian Christianity, creating a gulf between rulers and subjects. While other Mongol states, such as the Ilkhanate, eventually embraced Islam as a unifying force, the Chagatai Khanate resisted this shift for generations. The insistence on maintaining non-Islamic practices alienated the urban population, while also weakening the Khanate's ability to claim legitimacy in the eyes of its Muslim neighbours. It was not until the mid-14th century that Islam became the dominant faith of the ruling elite, transforming the character of the Khanate. The Chagatai Khanate also became deeply entangled in the politics of the wider Mongol world. It stood between the Ilkhanate to the west the Yuan dynasty to the east, and the Golden Horde to the north. Rivalries and shifting alliances drew it into repeated conflicts. Its rulers frequently contested control of borderlands, raided trade routes, and supported one side or another in the succession disputes that racked the empire after the death of the great Khans. Far from being a stable centre of power, the Chagatai Khanate was often the arena in which the larger fractures of the Mongol world were expressed. Despite the instability, the Khanate remained important because of its position along the Silk Road. Merchants passing from China to Persia or India inevitably travelled through its territories. Caravans laden with silk, spices, textiles, and precious metals brought wealth to the cities of Samarkand, Kashgar, and Bukhara. Control of these trade routes was a source of immense profit, but it also made the Khanate vulnerable to predation, as rival powers and internal factions competed to capture revenues from commerce. Banditry and corruption sometimes flourished, undermining the prosperity of the region. By the 14th century, the weakness of the Chagatai Khans became apparent. Authority fragmented between eastern and western halves of the realm, with Mogolistan in the east developing a separate identity under its own rulers. In the west, ambitious generals and local leaders often eclipsed the Khans themselves, reducing them to figureheads. Into this vacuum of authority stepped new powers, most famously Timur, the conqueror who rose from the steppes near Samarkand. Though Timur claimed legitimacy as a protector of the Chagatai line, in practice he dismantled their authority and established his own empire, drawing on the legacy of both Mongol and Islamic traditions. The rise of Timur marked the effective end of the Chagatai Khanate as a unified state, though fragments of it lingered in Mogolistan for centuries. The legacy of the Chagatai Khanate is complex. On one hand, it preserved the Mongol domination of Central Asia, maintaining links across the Silk Road and shaping the politics of the region for more than a century. On the other, its instability and refusal to integrate with its Muslim populations left it weaker than its counterparts. Where the Ilkhanate embraced Islam and fostered cultural flourishing, and the Yuan dynasty established itself as a Chinese dynasty, the Chagatai Khanate remained divided, a realm pulled between steppe traditions and the demands of its urban centres. Its history reflects the broader difficulty faced by the Mongols as they sought to govern societies vastly different from their own. In the end, the Chagatai Khanate stands as a reminder that the empire of Genghis Khan was never a monolith. It was a collection of families, regions and traditions, bound together by conquest but always subject to fragmentation. Central Asia, with its deserts and oases, its nomads and cities, became both the heartland of Mongol heritage and the stage where its contradictions were most evident. The power struggles of the Chagatai Khans and their rivals not only shaped the fate of the region, but also influenced the course of Eurasian history, as Timur rose from their decline to carve out a new empire in their shadow. The Mongol conquest brought terror and destruction in their wake, but once the dust of battle settled, the empire they created opened new possibilities for connection across the vast landmass of Eurasia. From the steppes of Mongolia to the markets of Baghdad, from the cities of northern China to the ports of the Black Sea, the Mongols established an unprecedented zone of stability that came to be known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. For nearly a century, the world's largest contiguous empire provided conditions in which merchants, scholars, diplomats and travellers could move with a freedom unmatched in earlier times. This was not peace in the sense of a cessation of war. Raids and conflicts still erupted at the edges of the empire, but it was peace in the sense of order, security, and the assurance that trade routes would be guarded, caravans protected, and the laws of the Khan enforced across thousands of miles. The scale of this transformation can be seen most clearly along the Silk Road. Before the Mongol ascendancy, the route was a fragile chain of markets and oases, vulnerable to bandits, political fragmentation, and the constant threat of local wars. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road was revitalized. The Khans understood that the wealth of their empire lay not only in conquest, but also in the flow of goods, taxes, and knowledge that commerce could provide. Stations known as yam or relay posts were established at regular intervals along major routes. These posts provided food, horses, and lodging for travellers, ensuring that envoys and merchants could move with speed and safety. The system allowed a message to travel from one end of the empire to the other at remarkable speed, a feat that astonished foreign observers and strengthened the bonds of administration across distant lands. Merchants from every corner of the known world were drawn into this system. Silk and porcelain from China moved westward in unprecedented quantities. Spices from India and Southeast Asia passed through Mongol-controlled territories on their way to the Middle East and Europe. From the steppes and Central Asia came horses, furs, and precious stones, while from Persia and beyond flowed carpets, textiles, and metalwork. The exchange was not one-directional. Silver from European mines found its way into Mongol markets, while glassware, wool, and other goods moved eastward. The empire created a single, interconnected commercial zone where wealth circulated on a scale that transformed local economies. But the Pax Mongolica was not only about goods. Ideas, technologies, and religions travelled along the same roads. Paper-making, printing, and gunpowder developed in China, spread westward, and began to alter the balance of power in Europe and the Middle East. Medical knowledge, astronomy, and mathematics moved across cultural boundaries, enriched by exchanges between scholars from Islamic, Chinese, and Indian traditions. Artistic motifs blended as Persian miniatures influenced Chinese painting, and Chinese ceramics inspired artisans in the Islamic world. The Mongols themselves, curious and pragmatic, often encouraged these exchanges, inviting scholars and craftsmen from distant lands to serve at their courts. The presence of foreign travellers at the Mongol courts became one of the most famous aspects of this period. Diplomats and merchants from Europe, envoys from the papacy, and adventurers seeking fortune all made the journey eastward. Among them was Marco Polo, whose descriptions of Kublai Khan's court and the wealth of China fascinated Europeans for generations. His account, though embellished, reflected the awe felt by many who encountered the scale and order of the Mongol world. Others, such as the Persian historian Rashid al-Din or the Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta, recorded the vibrancy and diversity of the empire, providing glimpses into a Eurasia connected in ways it had never been before. Religion too moved along these roads. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and Nestorian sects all found new adherents as missionaries and preachers travelled under the protection of Mongol law. The Khans, particularly in the earlier period, were known for their tolerance, often patronising multiple faiths and allowing them to flourish side by side. Temples, mosques, and churches could be found in proximity in major cities, reflecting the pluralism of an empire that encompassed nearly every belief system of the time. The Pax Mongolica also had unintended consequences. The same networks that carried goods and knowledge also carried disease. The Black Death, which erupted in the mid-14th century and swept across Europe, the Middle East and Asia, likely spread along the trade routes sustained by Mongol order. What had been a source of prosperity became the channel for catastrophe, as caravans and ships carried the plague from one continent to another. In this sense, the very interconnectedness that made the Mongol Empire extraordinary also made it vulnerable to crises of unprecedented scale. Politically, the Pax Mongolica rested on the authority of the Khans and their ability to enforce order. Laws were applied across vast distances, and punishments for banditry or corruption were severe. The Mongol rulers understood that their legitimacy as overlords depended on their ability to protect merchants and travellers. In this, they were remarkably successful. For decades, the safety of the roads and the openness of the empire created a sense of predictability that encouraged long-distance trade. This was a stark contrast to the fractured politics of earlier centuries, when merchants could only hope that local rulers would allow them to pass unmolested. For the populations who lived under Mongol rule, the Pax Mongolica brought both benefits and burdens. Taxes were heavy, and the demands of supplying the Mongol armies could be crushing. Yet the order imposed by the Khans also reduced the endemic warfare that had plagued many regions. Farmers could cultivate their fields with greater security, and urban markets flourished under the protection of Mongol garrisons. The empire created conditions in which prosperity could take root, even if it remained uneven and fragile. The legacy of this period was long-lasting. Even after the Mongol Empire fragmented into separate khanates, the networks it had fostered continued to shape Eurasia. The Silk Road remained active, and the knowledge, technologies and goods that had spread under Mongol protection had already transformed societies far beyond their original borders. Europe in particular was profoundly influenced by this exchange, as access to Asian goods and ideas helped lay the groundwork for the transformations of the late medieval and early modern periods. The Pax Mongolica stands as one of the most remarkable achievements of Mongol rule. From the ashes of conquest, they built a world in which connection was possible on a scale never before seen. It was a fragile peace, dependent on the strength of rulers and the fear they inspired, but while it lasted, it reshaped the course of history. The caravans that crossed the deserts of Central Asia, the ships that sailed from Chinese ports, the envoys who carried messages across continents, all were part of a system that bound together the fates of distant peoples. In its vast reach and enduring impact, the Pax Mongolica was both the culmination of Genghis Khan's vision and one of the clearest demonstrations of how conquest could give way to connection. The Mongol Empire at its height was the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the plains of Hungary, from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia. Yet the very scale that made it extraordinary also made it vulnerable. Holding such a vast and diverse territory together required not only military power, but also effective governance, and over time the bonds that had united the empire under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors began to fray. What emerged in place of a single empire was a collection of successor states, each following its own path, bound loosely by shared heritage but divided by geography, religion, and competing ambitions. The decline of Mongol unity was not sudden, but a gradual process of fragmentation, marked by disputes over succession, shifting loyalties, and the growing strength of local identities. One of the first sources of tension lay in the principle of succession itself. Genghis Khan had left his empire to his sons, with the understanding that the line of Ögedei, his third son, would provide the great Khan. But as generations passed, this arrangement became increasingly contested. Powerful branches of the family, particularly the descendants of Yotchi in the west and those of Chagatai in Central Asia, resented the dominance of the Ögedeids and sought greater autonomy. When Ögedei's line faltered, rival claimants from other branches pressed their claims, leading to disputes that could not be resolved without conflict. The authority of the great Khan in Karakoram and later in China under Kublai was no longer recognized as supreme by all parts of the empire. Geography played an equally decisive role. The empire spanned regions with vastly different cultures, economies, and traditions of governance. China required a bureaucratic apparatus of officials, records, and laws, while the steppes of Russia and Central Asia were ruled by tribal alliances and shifting loyalties. Persia demanded cooperation with long-established Islamic elites, while Eastern Europe was governed through tribute and indirect control. What worked in one region did not necessarily work in another, and over time, the rulers of these regions came to prioritize local needs over imperial unity. The Khans in Sarai or Tabriz or Samarkand found themselves less willing to submit to commands from distant courts that knew little of their circumstances. The conversion to different religions further deepened divisions. The Ilkhans in Persia eventually adopted Islam, aligning themselves with their Muslim subjects. The rulers of the Golden Horde too embraced Islam by the 14th century. By contrast, the Yuan dynasty in China relied on Buddhist and Confucian traditions, while maintaining some attachment to steppe shamanism. The Chagatai Khanate remained divided for generations over the question of religion, with some rulers resisting conversion and others embracing it. These divergences created not only ideological differences, but also diplomatic rivalries, as Muslim khanates sometimes found themselves opposed to the Buddhist Yuan or suspicious of each other's alliances. Economic strains compounded these divisions. The empire had been built on conquest, and the flow of wealth from newly subdued regions provided the resources needed to sustain it. Once the great conquest slowed, the costs of maintaining armies, garrisons and bureaucracies mounted. Tribute from subject peoples was never sufficient to cover expenses, and the temptation to exploit local populations grew. Heavy taxation, combined with corruption and inefficiency, bred resentment among peasants and townsfolk. In China, inflation caused by overissuance of paper money destabilized the Yuan dynasty. In Persia, failed experiments with currency and the cost of endless wars weakened the Khanate. Across the empire, the wealth that had once fueled expansion became a source of instability, as it was drained by internal conflict and mismanagement. The Black Death accelerated this decline. The very trade routes that had brought prosperity under the Pax Mongolica became the channels by which plague spread from Central Asia to Europe and the Middle East in the mid-14th century. Populations were decimated, economies disrupted, and the authority of rulers weakened. Cities that had once flourished under Mongol protection were emptied, their markets stilled. In some places, the Mongols themselves were blamed for spreading the disease, their movements and sieges seen as the origin of catastrophe. The pandemic struck at the heart of Mongol power, reducing their capacity to wage war, collect taxes, and sustain order. As the four major successor states, the Yuan dynasty, the Khanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Golden Horde, struggled, their fragmentation became clear. The Yuan faced constant rebellions and the growing strength of Chinese resistance, culminating in the rise of the Ming dynasty in 1368, which drove the Mongols back into the steppe. The Khanate collapsed after the death of Abu Sa'id in 1335, splintering into rival principalities that lacked the unity and authority of earlier rulers. The Chagatai Khanate fractured into eastern and western halves. Its authority eroded until Timur rose to claim power in Central Asia. The Golden Horde, once dominant in Eastern Europe, gradually lost control as Moscow and Lithuania grew stronger, and by the 15th century it too had divided into smaller khanates. What had once been a single empire now existed only as memory and legacy. Yet even in decline, the Mongols left a mark that endured. The successor states carried forward elements of Mongol governance, military organization, and cultural exchange. The very fragmentation of the empire shaped the rise of new powers: the Ming in China, the Ottomans in Anatolia, Moscow in Russia, and Timur's empire in Central Asia. Each of these drew upon the foundations laid during Mongol rule, even as they defined themselves in contrast to it. The story of Mongol decline is not one of sudden collapse, but of gradual transformation. Conquest had created an empire of unparalleled reach, but the strains of ruling so many lands, peoples, and traditions proved insurmountable. Local identities reasserted themselves, dynastic rivalries consumed resources, and the shock of disease and economic disruption hastened the unravelling. By the 15th century, the empire of Genghis Khan was no longer a political reality, but its echoes could still be felt across Eurasia, in the roads that remained open, in the cultural exchanges that had taken place, and in the memory of a time when one family's armies had brought much of the known world under a single banner. The Mongol Empire as a political entity faded centuries ago, its khanates splintered and overtaken by new dynasties, but the impact of its rise and rule still reverberates through world history. Few conquests have left such an enduring imprint on so many regions at once. The Mongols not only reshaped borders and toppled kingdoms, they altered the very patterns of interaction across Eurasia, laying foundations that influenced economies, politics, cultures, and ideas long after their armies had withdrawn. To understand their legacy is to see how conquest and destruction could coexist with connection and transformation, producing outcomes that no single ruler, even Genghis Khan himself, could have fully foreseen. One of the most significant legacies of the Mongols lay in the realm of geopolitics. Their conquest destroyed old powers and accelerated the rise of new ones. The Abbasid Caliphate, once a centre of Islamic authority, was ended with the sack of Baghdad in 1258. The Kievan Rus, already weakened by internal divisions, was permanently reshaped under Mongol domination, giving rise eventually to the ascendancy of Moscow. In China, the Yuan dynasty established by Kublai Khan introduced a new model of foreign rule, but its eventual collapse opened the way for the Ming dynasty, whose leaders drew lessons from Mongol practices while also rejecting their legacy. In Persia and Central Asia, Mongol invasions toppled older dynasties and created the conditions for the rise of Timur and later states that continue to claim Mongol heritage. The political map of Eurasia was redrawn in the centuries following the conquests, and the Mongols were among the decisive forces that pushed that transformation forward. Economically, the Mongols fostered a level of interconnection that had few precedents. The Silk Road, revitalized under their rule, created channels of exchange that linked Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and China in new ways. Goods flowed more freely, merchants travelled with greater security, and innovations spread across boundaries. While the Black Death exposed the dangers of such interconnectedness, the long-term result was a Eurasia more aware of itself as a single world. European hunger for Asian goods, intensified by the contacts made during the Pax Mongolica, eventually drove exploration that would lead to the maritime voyages of the 15th and 16th centuries. In this sense, the Mongols were part of the distant chain of causes that contributed to the European Age of Discovery and the first global networks of trade. The Mongols also left legacies in administration and governance. Though often remembered only for destruction, they showed remarkable adaptability in ruling diverse peoples. They employed Persian bureaucrats in the Ilkhanate, Chinese officials in the Yuan, and incorporated local traditions into their systems of rule. They introduced census-taking, standardized taxation, and relay stations for communication across their empire. These practices influenced successor states, shaping how governments approached the challenges of administering vast populations. The use of paper currency in China, though troubled under the UN, would become a foundation for later monetary systems. The discipline and mobility of the Mongol military, built on cavalry tactics and strict organization, influenced armies far beyond the steppes, leaving an imprint on the conduct of war for generations. Culturally, the Mongols acted as facilitators of exchange. Their courts attracted artisans, scientists, and scholars from across the known world. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din, working under the Ilkhans, compiled one of the great chronicles of world history, drawing on knowledge gathered from many cultures. Chinese technologies such as printing and gunpowder travelled westward, while artistic influences from the Islamic world enriched Chinese and Central Asian traditions. The Mongols themselves often showed curiosity about other ways of life, encouraging dialogue among religions, sponsoring translations, and creating environments in which Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, and Christian priests could interact. While they rarely produced original cultural works themselves, their role as connectors created conditions for cross-pollination that left deep marks on the intellectual life of Eurasia. Religion was another area where Mongol influence proved lasting. Though their initial conquests were marked by religious pragmatism and tolerance, the eventual conversion of different khanates to Islam profoundly affected the regions they controlled. The Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde both embraced Islam, strengthening the faith's role across the Middle East, Persia, and Eastern Europe. In China, the Yuan dynasty patronized Tibetan Buddhism, helping to establish its prominence. By encouraging pluralism in some places and adopting local religions in others, the Mongols contributed to the shifting religious map of Eurasia, reinforcing some traditions while opening space for new encounters. In Russia and Eastern Europe, the Mongol legacy was especially complex. The tribute system imposed by the Golden Horde entrenched patterns of centralized taxation and strong princely authority, particularly in Moscow. The experience of Mongol domination influenced the rise of a more autocratic style of rule, one that would characterize Russian governance for centuries. At the same time, the weakening of rival centers like Kiev allowed Moscow to emerge as the core of a new Russian state, one that would eventually overthrow Mongol overlordship but retain elements of the structures they had imposed. The Mongols, in this way, helped shape the trajectory of Russia as a distinct Eurasian power. Even in the realm of memory, the Mongols left a legacy that remains contested. In some traditions, they are remembered as destroyers, the scourge of God, who burned cities and slaughtered populations. Chronicles from Baghdad, Kiev and China speak with horror of the devastation they wrought. Yet in other contexts, they are recalled as unifiers who opened the world to trade, as patrons of culture who enabled exchanges, and as rulers who imposed order where chaos had reigned. The duality of their legacy reflects the complexity of their impact, neither wholly destructive nor wholly constructive, but a mixture that cannot be reduced to simple judgments. The Mongol Empire also left a legacy in the realm of identity. Many dynasties that arose in its wake claimed descent from Genghis Khan, or association with his conquests as a source of legitimacy. Timur styled himself as the heir to the Chagatai line, while later Khans of Central Asia continued to invoke Genghis's name. Even the Mughal dynasty of India, established by Babur in the 16th century, traced its roots back to the Mongol and Timurid heritage, carrying elements of their legacy into South Asia. In this way, the prestige of the Mongol name endured long after their political unity had dissolved. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of all was the demonstration of how interconnected the world could become. Before the Mongols, the idea that a message, a merchant, or a technology could travel from the shores of the Pacific to the Mediterranean in a matter of months seemed extraordinary. After the Mongols, it became a reality that others would seek to replicate by sea. The empire showed both the potential and the peril of such connectivity, offering a vision of a world tied together by roads, commerce, and empire, even as it revealed the fragility of such a system in the face of disease, rivalry, and internal strain. In this sense, the Mongols occupy a pivotal place in world history. They were the last great steppe empire, heirs to traditions of nomadic conquest stretching back to the Scythians and Huns, but they were also a bridge to the modern age of global interaction. Their story, marked by conquest, rule, and decline, remains one of the clearest illustrations of how empires can both destroy and create, leaving legacies that last long after their banners have fallen. To reflect on their legacy is to see how the forces of war and order, fear and exchange, destruction and connection, all converged in the extraordinary century when the Mongols reshaped the world. The story of the Mongols stretches from the windswept steppes of Mongolia to the crowded markets of Baghdad and the great cities of China, from the frozen forests of Russia to the deserts of Persia. It is the story of a people who rose from obscurity to create the largest land empire the world has ever known, who brought devastation and fear, but also trade, connection, and new patterns of life that reshaped entire continents. Their legacy can be seen not only in the ruins of the cities they conquered, but in the institutions, economies, and cultures that grew in their shadow. Looking back across the centuries, what began with small tribes of herders and warriors on the steppe became a force that bound together the known world. Even after the empire fragmented, even after dynasties rose and fell, the mark of the Mongols endured. It is a reminder that history is not simply a tale of rise and fall, but of transformation, of encounters that change the course of peoples and nations in ways they themselves could never imagine. The Mongols did not just leave behind a memory of conquest, they left behind a new vision of what was possible when distant worlds were drawn into contact. It is in those connections, as much as in the battles and the destruction, that their place in world history remains.